Britain's finest unit for forensic investigation, has a groundbreaking new mission. A mission that will put the full arsenal of modern forensics to the ultimate test. For the first time, the cold case team will strive to put a face to some extraordinary human remains from the long, distant past.
It's not the kind of face that children would happily look at. It's the kind of face that children would cry at. And that's quite sad for someone who's so very young.
Forensic anthropology, facial reconstruction, and painstaking research will open new windows on history as they reconstruct the lives of people not seen for centuries.
This historical research is allowing me to investigate people's experiences at different times throughout history.
He certainly had a nasty crack to the top of his head. That must have been so painful.
So we've got the face, the facial reconstruction, and we've added some textures.
Fantastic. That is just superb.
The team's latest case surrounds a puzzling skeleton discovered in a medieval Christian burial ground in Ipswich. The archaeologists who found the body believe the man is from Africa.
This is really important. What was he doing there?
What event could have brought an African to medieval Ipswich? And what led to his demise?
I think I may just have found a cause of death.
The investigation unearths evidence from the 13th century that will challenge the view of Britain's ethnic past.
It's amazing. It's just, it's what gets scientists excited.
Is this skeleton irrefutable proof of an African presence in medieval England? And if so, who is he? The Centre for Anatomy and Human Identification at the University of Dundee. The forensics team is about to start work on a curious skeleton presumed to be male and African. It was excavated from a medieval burial ground in Ipswich in the 1990s. But his identity and his story are a mystery. The first stage of the investigation is for Head of Unit Professor Sue Black to examine the skeleton, along with her colleague Dr. Xanthi Mallet.
Excavation medieval burial site in Ipswich.
Archaeological report on the site suggested the skull showed sub-Saharan African characteristics. Okay.
They record every detail.
The size of that.
And Sue is immediately struck by what could be a clue to confirming the skeleton's ethnic origin.
Good grief. Okay. Gosh, it's very wide. Look at the width of that. Huge palate. That's a jaw flaring that Tom Cruise would be very proud of.
Yep.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Or was it Ipswich?
Mm-hmm.
But before tackling the complex issue of his possible ancestry, they begin by putting an age to the man at time of death.
Well, we're definitely in the adult category. If you look at the sutures, they're in the process of closing. When you're very young, they're quite far apart and you can see them really clearly. And as you get older, they ossify and they sort of merge and fuse together. And they've started to disappear round at the back here. And that's an indication of age. So we've definitely got a mature adult here. We've not necessarily got an elderly adult, but we're at the older end of mature.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Not 40s, probably getting a bit older.
The archaeologists who discovered the skeleton classified it as sub-Saharan African, and the shape of its jaw would seem to fit with that.
Not an overly prognathic jaw, but it is a little bit prognathic, and I think we'd be very happy to agree with our classification of sub-Saharan African.
The whole investigation will hinge on being able to ascertain beyond any reasonable doubt where this man came from. Skull shape is commonly relied upon to indicate ethnic origin. Although every skull is unique, a prognathic or relatively prominent jaw is linked to skulls of sub-Saharan African ancestry. Over 3,000 miles from Ipswich.
Bottom line is, his skin was a different colour to yours and mine. And that's fundamentally what we mean. And when we look at him in terms of his position in Ipswich at that time, he'd have been really different.
Absolutely.
And he'd have been really different because of the colour of his skin.
The initial observation has confirmed that he was male, between 40 and 60 years old and around 5 feet 6 inches tall. But the cause of his death is still a mystery. And there's much more they'll need to substantiate about his ancestral origins.
He's a very well-developed, mature man, so a lot of muscle development in there. I think height-wise, he's not overly tall. He's sort of middling height, even by UK standards at that time. He's about 5'6", maybe 5'7". But he is, I would say, a 40 to 60-year-old male who may well be African in terms of his origin.
Okay, what we have today...
Before further analysis takes place, Sue and Xanthi need to discuss the case with Dr. Caroline Wilkinson. She will oversee the facial reconstruction and is the team's ancestry expert.
Angles of the jaw. Okay, ancestry is interesting because that's not something I know a lot about. I know you're much more comfortable with that than I am. The only thing that I picked up, apart from the really heavy, dense nature of the skull, was the palate. The palate was very wide and very big teeth, which was, to me, was a clear indication we're not talking, Anglo-Saxon, Celt kind of dentition at all.
I think he's going to have an interesting face. I'll be quite pleased to do a reconstruction on him. And if we're going to do facial reconstruction, we can do it from a laser scan. So.
Okay, so you want him laser scanned?
Yeah.
And they will need to gather a lot more information.
You really need to go back and speak to the archaeologists. I think we need to have some idea about where they were found, what type of a site it was, were there any other individuals around them, are we looking at high status, low status, is there anything known about that archaeological site, were there any artefacts? I think that's a really important way to go. Yep. Excellent. I think that's all we can do.
Yep.
I think what makes him interesting is the potential ancestry. So the fact that we might be looking from somebody who's sub-Saharan African. And in Ipswich, I think in medieval times, that for me is very interesting. It might not be something that in a modern scenario, if I was doing a forensic case, would be in the least little bit unusual. But I can't help feeling that if we go back to medieval times, this is somebody who would stand out.
Xanthi leaves Dundee to start her historical road trip. Her task is to hunt down any information she can that will help the team build up a profile of who the man was.
I'm very lucky in that I have been given an opportunity by the University of Dundee to construct a team. And everybody who is in this department is handpicked for a variety of reasons.
Dr. Wolfram Meyer-Augenstein is the team's stable isotope expert. He will analyse trace minerals found deep inside the Ipswich man's skeleton, which could tell us where he lived.
There is nobody else that I would trust for a forensic investigation. He is the best that there is, and he has not only a national reputation, he has a huge international reputation.
In order to carry out his isotopic analysis, Wolfram needs samples of teeth and bone. The information it could reveal is vital. A single molar tooth could reveal where in the world the Ipswich man spent his early years, while a small section of his thigh bone could tell us where he was living in the last years of his life.
What we see here might overlap with the information we get from the tooth, or it might actually be completely different, should the person have moved. And since I understand the person was found in a grave in Ipswich, and you have information that he might be of sub-Saharan descent, clearly he must have moved during his lifetime at some stage.
Xanthi has come to Ipswich, where the skeleton was discovered. In medieval times, Ipswich was a thriving port situated on the River Orwell. The town had connections across Europe, and the route is still used for trading to this day. Medieval England is often thought of as an insular society, but in reality it was at the centre of a network of globalised trading. It's not hard to imagine a means by which an African man could have got here.
In medieval times, Ipswich would have been a huge port that would have been really very busy with trade, and lots of international crews would have travelled up here from all over the world.
The burial site where the man was found is located near the river. Xanthi's hoping she can dig up some clues about his identity.
Xanthi's enthusiasm and her personality and her character makes her ideal for going out and asking people questions, and she does that particularly well.
She's meeting Keith Wade from Suffolk Archaeology. They excavated the bodies back in the 1990s before the site was built on as part of a new housing development.
Before the flats were built, we excavated the whole site, and the last phase of activity was a cemetery. And it lies within the precinct of a friary, the Franciscan friary, the Grey Friars. And the friary was built in about 1290 and then was suppressed in 1538. This shows all the features excavated on this site. These burials are they're all in single graves.
He was where, did you say, approximately? He's up
Roughly
right
there.
in the corner?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can show you a photograph.
Oh, is this his actual burial?
Yeah, that's the actual burial. And as you can see, it looks like a fairly standard medieval burial.
And why has he been dated medieval?
We have very little evidence, other than the fact that's the type of burials you normally see in the medieval period. And one of them has a belt buckle, which is late 13th or 14th century.
So, our Ipswich man was discovered in a burial ground next to a Christian friary. Two pieces of evidence suggest he is medieval. A belt buckle found among the 150 skeletons, and also the friary itself was only in operation between the mid-13th and the mid-16th centuries. Before the investigation can proceed, there is an important question to answer. Just how unusual is it for an African skeleton to be found in a burial site from this time period? To find out, Xanthi has come to the University of London to meet medieval historian and migration expert Professor Jim Bolton.
Nice to meet you.
We found a medieval individual who's of African origin. Is that as unusual as my kind of gut instinct is telling me it is?
Yes, undoubtedly. Okay. Undoubtedly. It's very unusual indeed. There is some written evidence, I think, of Africans in medieval England, but to find skeletons, I've not come across it before at all.
So what do we know about the history of migration to this country?
If you go back to the Roman occupation of Britain, then you would expect to find Africans and people from the Middle East here as soldiers, as merchants in particular, and you would expect that because Rome is a multinational empire. Then you get a huge gap, and that's between the end of the Roman Empire, as it were, and almost the 16th and 17th centuries, when Africans begin to come into England because of the slave trade and as personal servants in great households. But between the fall of the Roman Empire, which is 5th century AD, and about 1600, then it is rare to find Africans. It's very rare indeed. And very rare that they should be in a friary as well, because that assumes they've been given a Christian burial. And most of the people I know who come from Africa or North Africa or Spain would be Muslim. So why would they end up in a Christian burial ground?
What Professor Bolton has told Xanthi has raised the stakes in the investigation. Between the fall of the Roman Empire and the 16th century, there are virtually no records of Africans in England. This makes the Ipswich man so improbable that the team must be sure of their findings. And the first thing they must prove scientifically is the age of the skeleton. Is he really medieval? To find out, a sample of the Ipswich man's bone has been sent for carbon dating. The bone sample is crystallized into a powder which is then combusted in a sealed glass tube and converted into a gas. The gas is then converted back to solid carbon, which can be analysed and dated. An accelerator mass spectrometer analyses the ratio of radiocarbon content, which will ascertain the age of the bones themselves. It's a vital part of the investigation, but it will be 2 weeks before the team get the results. Caroline Wilkinson is responsible for giving the Ipswich man a face. She is one of the world's leading facial reconstruction experts, working on historical faces as well as contemporary criminal investigations.
Her scientific background, her artistic background, and her intuitive nature when it comes to faces in particular is absolutely second to none. So I'm very fortunate I have a world-class leader in her field in this department.
She will perform a detailed examination of the skull with her colleague Caroline Needham.
Okay. Do you want them separate for now? Wow.
If we've got some guttering and we've got quite rectangular orbits, that would suggest more sub-Saharan African. So you can see the mouth's a bit further forward than the rest of the face.
Yeah.
Which again would suggest African. Mm-hmm. And really wide palate, which again is another sub-Saharan African trait. Interesting.
Interesting face, huh?
So, I mean, I'd say that it looks like it could be sub-Saharan African. I would say the nose is not typical.
Okay. But not impossible.
And the shape of the cranium is not typical.
Mm-hmm.
But there's quite a lot of other indicators.
Although Caroline agrees that he is of African origin, she thinks he's likely to be North African, from a country like Morocco or Tunisia. And she's hoping that some of the team's tests will help pinpoint his origins. Whatever the results, she's in no doubt that he will be a striking individual.
We might get an indication of ancestry from DNA analysis, and also we might be able to tell where the person has lived by looking at stable isotope analysis, and that might in itself indicate ancestry. It's quite a big, robust, very muscly face, so it's going to be quite an interesting skull to reconstruct. I think he's going to have a very individual face.
The first stage of the process is to create a laser-scanned 3D model. This will be used as a base for the layers of facial tissue. But Caroline will need further historical and scientific evidence in order to recreate his face accurately. For Xanthi, the lack of knowledge of Africans in medieval England makes researching this case a unique challenge. What was the African doing here? And what would people have made of him? Xanthi has come to the National Archives in Kew to meet a man who has single-handedly been trying to build an evidence-based picture of early African history in England. Onyeka has been researching thousands of medieval documents, and what he's found is fascinating. He has come to the conclusion that the African found in Ipswich would have been treated with more tolerance than we've seen during later periods of history.
The Africans who were here would have been here doing a specific skill or trade. Their position would have been determined by personal relationships that they developed,
Right.
rather than based upon skin color. There was not a scientific understanding of race. That comes about in the 19th century.
Yeah.
The idea that human groups fall into different specific racial categories, that was not present in medieval England.
How many individuals of African origin would you have found in the UK back in the medieval period?
That's difficult for us to know.
Yeah.
Because during the medieval period, there are not consistent and substantial records. There are few records of the population as a whole, let alone of an African presence. However, having said that, we have in the Abrevito Doomsday Book of 1241, this African.
1241?
1241.
So what does this mean?
Now, this is an African image, an image of an African, from an account for Derby.
The Abbreviato of Doomsday Book was the 13th century version of the original Doomsday Book of 1086, the first survey of the English population. This is one of the only known images of an African in medieval England, but Onyeka feels it's highly significant.
But the point is that there was an African that the idea of the African was known in 13th century England.
Which is just the right time period.
It's just the right period for your African, yes? People draw pictures of them in image-wise, yes? And therefore it is highly likely that Africans were part of medieval society.
By the 16th century, there are an increasing number of recorded African images in British history, such as that of John Blank, Henry VIII's favourite trumpeter. But among the 11 million documents at the National Archives is some extraordinary evidence that as the numbers of black people in England increased, attitudes started to change.
This document, created between 1595 to 1596, is a record of letters and proclamations created during the reign of Elizabeth I.
Okay.
This letter is addressed to the Lord Mayors of the major cities, and it says in the letters, if you look, it says the word blackamoors. You notice that word there? It says blackamoors here and blackamoors there.
So this is another word for African individual,
That's
a blackamoor.
Right. The word moor by itself means black, and black added on means essentially black.
Black.
Yes. So it's emphasising what these people look like.
Right.
But the letter reads, an open letter to the Lord Mayors of London and the Aldermen, his brethren, and to all other mayors, sheriffs, and Her Majesty, understanding that there are of late divers blackamoors brought into this realm, of which kind of persons there are already here too many, considering how God hath blessed this land with great increase of people of our own nation.
Onyeka believes that the lack of mentions in records is simply because in medieval times people saw less need to comment on the colour of a person's skin. So far, the team has relied on anthropology and historical research to establish the origins of the Ipswich Man. But as they reassemble at the evidence board, it's time to see if these conclusions will be supported by some hard science. Was this man alive during medieval times? And does he definitely come from Africa?
Okay, today we're going back to Ipswich Man. This is the Sub-Saharan African male, possibly medieval, and that's because there was a belt buckle with one of the individuals from that group that was a medieval belt buckle.
Sue has been sent the results of the carbon dating.
The material is human bone.
Good.
And, oh, I like having knowledge that no one else has got. So, well, the date that they have given us in terms of the range is going to be 1190 AD and 1300 AD. So that's coming in at 805 years, plus or minus 30, before the present date.
Wow.
Have a white pen, sir.
So the date of the Ipswich Man is confirmed. And Wolfram also has some exciting results.
And I have a better chance coming from Mars than this guy having come from Ipswich. Because the tooth data definitely put him in a hot climate, near coastal, near equatorial climate. So that the southernmost point from a European perspective would be something like Portugal, maybe southern parts of Spain.
Okay.
And then we have to move either into the Middle East or basically northern Africa, places like Sierra Leone, Morocco, that sort of thing.
The stable isotope testing of the tooth supports Caroline's opinion that the skeleton is North African. But the tests done on the man's leg bone prove he died somewhere like the UK.
The bone oxygen data is consistent with where he was buried.
Okay.
In the broadest possible sense. We can't really say it's absolutely pinpoint accuracy Ipswich, but it's consistent with the UK.
And that tends to be consistent, that says this is at least 10 years in this sort of vicinity. If not more.
If not more. It's definitely inconsistent with anything that's arid and warm and near equatorial or coastal.
We know that he grew up in a
Yes,
warm,
there are two
dry
different
place, and
As
the
opposed
last
to
part
somewhere
of his
cold and
life he was
miserable.
in a cold,
There
wet
are
place.
two different, and he must have lived in that colder climate for, let's say, at least 10 years.
Okay.
The scientific analysis has provided two vital pieces of information. The team now have proof that the skeleton dates from between 1190 and 1300 AD and is likely to have come from somewhere in northern Africa or possibly southern Europe, but it has not narrowed it down to an exact country. Nevertheless, this information allows Xanthi to focus her historical research. And for Sue, it opens a new line of inquiry.
You know, at the outset, we just wondered, was there an ethnic issue here? Oh boy, is there an ethnic issue? There's a real ethnic issue. We have an African gentleman in Ipswich in the 1200s. Now, there is no doubt. So the science that's come together with the history, with the archaeology, this is really interesting. This is really important. What was he doing there?
The man's exact country of origin is still unclear, but another scientist hopes that further analysis will reveal this information. Ian Barnes from the Royal Holloway University of London has come to Dundee to take a sample of bone for DNA analysis. He hopes to find a DNA sequence that could identify the exact origins of the Ipswich man. He wears protective clothing to avoid contaminating the sample with his own DNA.
One of the concerns is that DNA from other individuals may actually get into the sample. So in order to avoid having our real DNA from the skeleton getting swamped out, we try and work as carefully and as cleanly as possible, and then hopefully we'll be able to get a real sequence out of it that comes from that skeleton, not from outside.
Xanthi is back on the historical trail. Why did the man come here? What brought an African from a life on the Mediterranean to a burial next to an English friary? The friary where the skeleton was discovered was built by Franciscan Grey Friars, who originally came over to England from Italy in 1224. The Grey Friars were great travellers, spreading their word and converting people across Europe to their cause. Is this how the Ipswich man came to England? Did he come here as a friar? Xanthi has come to meet Brother Philippe, a modern-day Grey Friar, to hopefully learn more about who our man was.
The friary in Ipswich was founded in the first years of the reign of Edward I, so it was certainly founded before 1298 because it was founded by a fellow called Sir Robert Tiptot and his wife Una, and Robert Tiptot died in 1298. So we know it was in the reign of Edward I, probably the 1270s, but absolutely certainly before the 1290s.
If he was found within the friary grounds, who would have been buried there?
Well, that's interesting because in 1250, Pope Innocent IV, in a letter called Cum Tamquam Veri, gave to the friars the privilege to be able to bury the friars and those of the family, so those people who serve the friars.
Oh, I see. So the fact that he was in a friary, a burial ground associated with a friary, is indicative he was either a friar or he worked with the friars in support of them.
Probably. It would be certainly possible that he could be a friar, I think. On the other hand, it could have been a person who was sort of close to the friars, who worked with them, who did a lot for them or with them, who was buried there. You know, those would be, I say, the two strongest possibilities.
One of the individuals within the group had a belt buckle with them, which is medieval. Okay. So obviously that would be a personal possession, wouldn't it? If this was a group of friars, would one of them have had personal possessions with them like that?
Well, the friars themselves wouldn't have been allowed personal possessions. The friars would have been buried in their habit, and the Franciscans used a rope to bind themselves, and they didn't have belts. So having a belt buckle would indicate that this was somebody who was not a Franciscan friar, but possibly a lay helper or somebody else who would have been buried in the graveyard.
Yeah.
Although the belt buckle may not have belonged to the Ipswich man, its presence in the burial ground challenges the idea that he himself was a friar. But to be buried next to a friary, he would have needed to be a Christian, at a time when most of North Africa was predominantly Muslim, and when Muslims and Christians were at war. The friary was built by a man called Robert Tiptoft in the 13th century. This was when Europe and the Middle East were consumed by the Crusades, a series of ferocious wars fueled by the clashing ideologies of Islam and Christianity. Dr. Adrian Bell from the University of Reading has been hunting for records that could link the Ipswich man with the friary. Could he have come to England as a result of the Crusades?
We know that Lord Tiptoft actually built the friary, didn't he? So I understand that there may be a link between our individual and Tiptoft.
Yes, and he established friary sometime in the 1270s, and he's actually buried there, and we know that from this...
Actually in the friary grounds itself?
Yes, itself,
Oh, okay.
yeah. And we know this from this book called Weaver's Funerary Monuments, which is an antiquarian historian in the 1600s who goes around churches writing down what he sees in them. And here he describes the Grey Friary at Ipswich, where he says the Grey Friars founded by Lord Tiptoft, in which lay buried Sir Robert Tiptoft, knight, and his wife. The interesting thing is that Robert Tiptoft himself travels to the Holy Land as part of a crusade.
Oh, really?
Led by the Lord Edward, that's the future Edward I, from 1270 to 1271. And they stop at various places, including Tunis.
The Ninth Crusade is commonly seen as the last major mission to the Holy Land. On their way, the Knights of Prince Edward stopped at Tunis with King Louis of France, who was renowned for converting Muslims to Christianity. Accompanying Edward was Robert Tiptoft.
We actually have evidence that Tiptoft did go on crusade. It can be found in the Pipe Roll, which is basically a government document showing expenditure, and it actually shows here that it's paid out to Robert Tiptoft for his service with 6 knights, that's himself and 5 others, and they're paid 100 marks each for that service.
It's Latin.
That's in Latin, yes. So these are the original Pipe Rolls, a collection showing who was paid, and there's 225 knights in total paid here, 100 marks each.
For their crusading activity?
For their crusading activity.
So we have evidence here that Tiptoft, who was buried in Ipswich, who actually developed the friary in Ipswich, went on these crusading activities to North Africa. Was there any evidence to show that Africans were actively brought back to England as part of this crusade?
Yes, there is, because in the Floris Historiarum we have an entry for 1272 where it actually says that after their voyage from the Holy Land, a number of nobles, including Thomas of Clare, or Thomas de Clare, who is also with Robert Tiptoft on crusade, brought back 4 captive Saracens. And in that sense, Saracen is a word that's used to describe Muslim or someone from North Africa.
Okay, so he could have been converted and then brought back during one of the Crusades?
Yeah, I mean, that seems a likely story for the 1270 Crusade.
One of the knights accompanying Tiptoft on the crusade, Thomas de Clare, is recorded as having brought 4 Saracens back to London with him. Whether they were prisoners, trophies, or free men will remain a mystery. But this makes it plausible that Tiptoft himself also brought back Africans, such as our Ipswich man, from Tunisia to England.
It says that, yes. So yes, he's dead by about...
Although the evidence is over 700 years old, it has finally provided an explanation for how the Ipswich man travelled from Africa to England.
I mean, obviously, we're never going to know exactly why this individual was in Ipswich. But what's interesting is we've actually found a documented case of how people were being moved around the world from North Africa to the UK.
Back in Dundee, Caroline is starting the facial reconstruction. Using a 3D scan of the skull, she begins to layer on the muscles and build up the foundations of our man's face.
In theory, you shouldn't need to know the ancestry of an individual to reconstruct their face, because the majority of the standards that we use apply to all ancestry groups. And if somebody has a narrow nasal aperture, for example, they're always going to have a narrow nose regardless of the ancestry group that they come from. But there are fine details that are reliant on knowing the origins of the individual, and they will make small differences to the face.
Caroline might have to make a best guess about the man's skin tone and eye colour.
Well, those details will be reliant on knowing whereabouts the individual is from, which is obviously slightly problematic for us.
Already, a distinctive face is emerging.
I think because it was quite a robust skull that was very large, with heavy brow ridges and clearly a very large neck, I had this preconceived idea that he was going to be quite big and butch, which he is, but he's also got a very nice balanced features that mean that he's a lot more attractive than I thought he was going to be.
With both the historical and scientific evidence having made good progress, the team reassembles at the evidence board. Historical evidence points to the man possibly coming from Tunis in North Africa. But will Ian Barnes be able to confirm this with the DNA testing?
Hi, Ian.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, I'm all right, yeah. How are you?
We're surviving. It's a sunny and very warm day in Dundee, which doesn't happen very often.
No. Should you be outside?
Probably, in bikinis, but it would scare the horses, so we won't do that. What have you got for us?
Right, so we've got some DNA out to sample it anyway. Basically, we find it today on both on the north and south shores of the Mediterranean, yeah? So all the way from Spain, going east through Italy, Greece, and then on the southern shore we find it in Morocco and in Egypt. And then we find it in Turkey.
That ties up with what my conclusions were on the geographic origin from what I got from the teeth. So what you were saying from the DNA seems to fit very nicely with the stabilized isotopes.
Thanks very much indeed, Ian.
Thanks, Ian.
Okay.
Cheers,
right,
bye. Bye.
Bye.
Although the DNA analysis agrees with Wolfram's stable isotope results, it's not narrowed down the skeleton's origin to a specific country. But Sue wants to bring all the data together. The anthropological study of his bones, the stable isotope tests, and now the DNA results. Can all three disciplines work together?
So we're still happy about the African ancestry in some regards. What we're less happy about is sub-Saharan label that was given at the outset. And there are areas that Ian has suggested and that your isotopes have also suggested that it could be that we're less happy with because it doesn't fit with the anthro. But the area where the anthro, the isotopes and the DNA all come together, that they're happy as along the north coast of Africa.
That's true.
The conclusions are compelling. Ipswich Man is likely to be of North African origin. This supports the idea that he started his life in Tunisia before being brought back to the UK during the 9th Crusade.
To have those three areas all pinpointing you down to the same part of the world in scientific terms is huge. It's big, it's amazing. It's just, it's what gets scientists excited. We know what he's going to look like, we know where he's come from. But what we don't know is why he's there, and ultimately what it was that killed him. We don't know that either. So he's a little bit out of focus still.
Sue wants to know how he died. She decides to take another look at the skeleton. Do the bones have anything left to reveal about the end of this man's life?
There's a general principle in policing which says once you get to the point of a cold case, where a case goes as far as it can and it doesn't come to a conclusion, the best thing you can do in terms of policy is go back to the beginning and start again. Look at it again in a slightly different light, maybe with other questions foremost in your mind. It's a good principle, good forensic principle.
Even the smallest detail could transform the investigation. As she looks at the spinal column, something grabs her attention.
I think I may just have found a cause of death.
It's a thrilling discovery.
What is interesting, which was missed the last time, is the fact that it looks like he's got a spinal abscess. So that perfectly round hole is pus formation, so that we've got an infection that's going into the spinal canal. What that will do is that will compress the spinal cord. This is at the level of the 9th thoracic vertebrae, so that's going to be affecting lower limb mobility. So that's going to knock out a significant number, probably of the sensory and the motor fibres to the lower limb. There's a lot of pain in that, tremendous amount of pain, and a level of pain that you'd probably want to find some assistance to overcome. I mean, you know, the question is, could that kill him? Well, the bottom line is any form of an infection at any time pre-penicillin can kill you. It may be something as simple as a skin scratch or an abscess on a tooth, but an abscess into the spinal cord, then we're going to be talking about a serious amount of infection, an infectious level. So that, yes, that could well have contributed to his death. That's a large sac of pus-filled abscess. If it's at that level there, then the chances are it's spread throughout the rest of his body. You don't have penicillin, you don't have a means to combat those bacteria. The body system just shuts down.
In what could turn into an extraordinary twist in this tale, it appears the Ipswich man was disabled and infirm in the last months or years of his life. It also gives the team a probable cause of death, the holy grail of any forensic investigation. So, the team has a profile of where the Ipswich man came from, they know why he might have come to Ipswich, and even how he might have died. But what they still don't know is why he was buried by a friary. What was he doing there? He was discovered with 150 other skeletons. Xanthi is keen to see if any of the other bodies can shed further light on the events surrounding his death. Who were they, and why were they all buried together? Sue Anderson carried out the original bone study of the skeletons. At the St Nicholas Centre, next to the site of the medieval burial ground, 12 of the skeletons found near the Ipswich man have been laid out.
So this is our burial population from the gravesite just up the road, isn't it? So what are we looking at here? We've got 12 individuals laid out.
Yeah.
What's unusual about this population then?
It's got quite a high proportion of pathological specimens and also quite a high proportion of men and older individuals.
It quickly becomes apparent that this is no ordinary group of skeletons.
This is probably something called diffuse idiopathic skeletal hyperostosis.
Oh, we've got some pathology here.
He's got areas of infection and inflammation on his legs. He had quite an enlarged frontal bone.
So he would have looked unusual as well?
Yeah.
This would be a result of a number of disease processes, wouldn't it? There's basically no cavity there, is there, for the white blood cells at all? That's weird. And bone should not look like that, should it? You've got 3 vertebrae completely fused here. Another pretty unhealthy individual.
He's got a disease called Paget's disease.
Almost all the bodies exhibit signs of debilitating disease or injury.
Much finer. It's got a very large abscess formed here.
So she's got a spinal abscess. Now that's interesting because the individual that we're looking at had a spinal abscess.
Yeah. And certainly that one isn't healed.
No. So this would still have been active at the time of death.
Yeah.
So none of these people are healthy, are they? There's nobody here that just, I don't know, fell over and hit their head and died. These are all people who've had some long-term pathology, disease that's showing that they've had long enough that it's showing in their skeleton.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's not something that's killed them quickly.
No.
They're an interesting population, aren't they?
Yes.
I'm not an archaeologist by training. I don't go out every day looking at archaeological populations and burial sites, but to me this seems a very unusual population. My first impression of this group is that we're looking at a group that have been buried together for a reason. This is not a natural kind of demographic of a burial site that I would expect to see. So my response when I see all of this together evidentially is that we're probably looking at an infirmary population, people who are being cared for and were buried there as a result of their disease or other pathology processes.
This site was a final resting place for the profoundly sick. But why? How would a friary have ended up associated with a graveyard full of the diseased and infirm? Was this in fact a medieval hospital? Angela Montfort has written a book that explores the link between friars and medicine in the medieval period. Xanthi has asked her to come to Dundee to see the Ipswich skeleton.
The Franciscans in particular were known as apothecaries.
Oh, really?
They would grow herbs for medicine in the infirmary, the friary infirmary garden. And we know that the friars used to give medicine charitably to people.
Is it likely that the friars would actually have been taking care of these individuals on site?
There are quite close links between the friars and medicine. When St. Francis first told his friars to serve the poor, he was expecting them to visit the sick. The whole view of medicine and life generally was that it was all one integral part, and that the medicine of the soul was also important as the medicine of the body. And so a medical friar could treat both of them. And in fact, some friars were called the physicians of the soul.
At a time when religion and medicine went hand in hand, the friars were helping to treat the sick not just with prayers, but also with what was then state-of-the-art medicinal knowledge. Would their treatments have been used to help treat the Ipswich man as he succumbed to the pain and disability of his spinal abscess? Dr. Tig Lang is a herbalist who has studied the use of herbs in medieval medicine.
What are we going to be making
Well,
today?
we're going to be making an ointment that would have been used for paralysis. It's mentioned in a herbal called Of the Virtues of Herbs, or Maca Floridus on the Virtues of Herbs. And this herbal was around in the period that we're talking about with your skeleton. And the recipe itself reads, this ointment will wonderfully help to the palsy. That means it will wonderfully help to heal paralysis. What it actually is isn't an ointment, it's a rubbing oil. And what they're basically intending to do is massage. They say here, if the patient is often with this ointment rubbed with, I love this bit in the English, with hundes sumdel harder, which means with somewhat hard hands. So they're obviously dealing with somebody who's massaging quite firmly. And this ointment will make all his body supple and easy.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, what we have here is dried pellitory.
Okay.
And
Dr. Lang is demonstrating how the herb pellitory could have been used by the friars.
Got some oil.
We've got some oil, which is olive oil.
So literally it's just...
You just put a few handfuls in and we'll see what happens when we stir this on the gas. Often, in later recipes, certainly, you find the instruction to boil it for as long as it takes you to say the Paternoster, which is a lovely way of timing, if you think, if you haven't got a clock. That's boiling in the oil now. That's boiled long enough, I think, to bring the virtues of the herb into the oil.
I couldn't really smell the herbs, but that smells
You see,
fantastic.
it's gone beautifully green.
That's quite nice. Quite like that.
And pellitory does have a warming effect.
Oh, does it?
So that it would make the skin
For
warm
massage,
up.
that
So
would
it's
be
medieval
perfect.
Ralgex.
Some kind of therapeutic.
We're all acting as if it's hand cream.
I know, yeah. Well, it's quite nice, isn't
We're
it?
going to get hot hands.
Obviously, this is not going to help somebody with paralysis, but, you know, may have brought some level of comfort, at least.
Yes, I think given that his paralysis is leading from a spinal abscess, no amount of what they do to his limbs is going to do him any good at all.
No.
But we can't say they did use this ointment on him, but it's an ointment which was available at the time, which they may have used in an attempt to bring comfort to the patient, or even in their way of an attempt to bring cure to the disease, because they wouldn't have known about the abscess.
But I think what's nice now is we know that this individual had quite a serious spinal abscess, and I also now know that they grew herbs and they produced some sort of medicinal herbs for treatment of paralysis. So it's nice to know that even though they couldn't have done anything to assist with the abscess specifically, he may have been getting some sort of palliative care that may have at least eased his discomfort, because this would have been a really uncomfortable, painful condition.
The picture emerging is of a middle-aged African man living out his final years in England, receiving care from a friary. He lived in the UK in the mid-13th century, and analysis of his bones has proved that he was here for at least 10 years before he died. He could have enjoyed years of good health before ending up in the infirmary. Did he settle here, set up a home, have a family? We can never know. But Xanthi has heard of an exciting new study that suggests our shared ethnic history goes back further than we think. And it's written in our DNA. St Pancras International Railway Station, a modern-day symbol of the global travel that has helped create our ethnically diverse nation. She's here to meet Dr. Mark Jobling, a geneticist from Leicester University. His studies on the male Y chromosome could help support the idea of an early African presence in the UK.
What would you say the normal view of ancestry in England, the UK, is?
Well, I think the history books are dominated by the stories we all know about Anglo-Saxons and Vikings and Romans before them, and then maybe Celts and Picts and so on. So there isn't much of a place for Africans in that story.
So what is the actual ancestry? This pale skin, is it kind of hiding a more complex ancestral past?
Well, it's certainly, in our study, we find that it does hide a bit of a more complex past, yes. So what we were interested in doing was studying a piece of DNA that's passed down from father to son, the Y chromosome. And the nice thing about that is it associates with surnames. And we found that we can look at some surnames and find in them a signature of an African lineage.
Could you see this as a visual, or was it just hiding in the genes?
Absolutely not. So the man who carried this lived close to our lab, and so we brought him in and talked to him about it. And he's a white, ordinary British guy with no history in his family of any contact with Africa. So he was completely surprised about this.
So he's a Yorkshire, UK resident, pale skin, typically British looking, but he's got an African heritage.
He has, yes. Specifically, he has an African Y chromosome. So this is the piece of DNA that passes down from father to son. So it means back in the past, at some point, he has a paternal ancestor who was an African who came probably from northwestern Africa.
What this could mean is that the British population has been multi-ethnic for far longer than we might think. Could our Ipswich man even have contributed himself to this African ancestral signature seen in our DNA today?
So the individual that we've been investigating is of African origin, we know that, and he's buried in Ipswich. Is there anything that you know of that could suggest any information that he could have been mixing with the population as far back as the medieval period?
Well, there could have been. From our evidence at the moment, we can't say that, but we could imagine finding other surnames where we can trace the history back into the medieval period. And I think if we had large enough sample sizes, we could probably do that.
I think what we've found by finding this African individual in Ipswich is that possibly the multiracial society that we think of as a very modern construct, we think of Britain as very ethnically diverse now, but only recently. Whereas it seems that this African individual in Ipswich may represent a much longer history of multiracial Britain that nobody really knew about.
This extraordinary case is reaching a conclusion. Using the modern arsenal of forensic science and historical detective work, the cold case team has painstakingly reconstructed a story that could have stayed buried forever. Possibly born a Muslim in 13th century Tunisia, our man could have come to England during the Ninth Crusade, converting to Christianity before living here for some time. As he succumbed to the pain of a spinal abscess in later life, he was very possibly nursed to his death by Franciscan friars, leaving behind irrefutable proof of an African presence in medieval England. Sue brings the team together at the evidence board for the final time to confirm the cause of death.
So we actually missed a spinal abscess. So given where this is occurring, which is at mid to lower thoracic level, we have somebody who is really disabled in their ability to move around and to be able to look after themselves.
And it's time for the final piece of the jigsaw to fall into place. Caroline is ready to reveal the face of the skeleton for the first time in 800 years.
Let's have a look at him then.
Maybe my favourite.
Okay. Ipswich man, here we go.
Oh. There we go.
He's a bit of a bruiser, isn't he?
Yes, definitely.
Well, yeah, he's definitely got this big, strong, robust head and neck. Hair, obviously.
I like the lips, actually.
Yeah, I
yeah.
think his ears are fantastic.
Hair, we don't know. He could have had.
Quite delicate
He could have had
to the rest.
He could have had a full beard. He could have had lots of hair. He could have gone bald. We have no idea.
Yeah,
so, which is why we haven't given him any of that. Yeah. And we've also got this quite massive neck as well.
Yeah, but
see why
he
you
was
like
very,
him.
he was very
great.
well. He was
I
very
think
well
he's
muscled.
quite beautiful, actually. He's got a great face.
Yeah.
What is interesting is that the historians are saying there is evidence that we have African individuals in the UK and in England, specifically from Roman times. We've certainly got them in the medieval times. We've even got a situation in history where in Tudor times Elizabeth I is saying, actually we've got too many, we need to stop this, we need to send them back. And how do you go from a small number of individuals to a community to such a point that you've got the monarchy saying this is too much, we have to be able, we have to stop this happening. And I think that's interesting, and there's no doubt that the historians are saying this hasn't been researched, and I think it should. And if nothing else, what we've done is said, here's one, absolutely, here's one, we found it, excuse me. All the rest, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. This one is. Start with this one.
A man discovered in an unmarked medieval grave could now change the view of our ethnic history.
The first impressions, I think, of this case were not very exciting, is the honest truth. And we should learn from that. We really should learn from that. That it's always the case that the ones that look as if they are the most boring often end out to surprise the heck out of us and become really some of the most interesting stories. We have scientifically identified, beyond all reasonable doubt, which is all any court in the land will ask of us, is that this individual is of African ancestry. We're happy with the age, we're happy with the sex, we're happy with the stature, and we're absolutely confident on the ethnic or geographical origin of this individual. That's rare. That's very, very rare to get to that point of certainty on ethnicity. And in terms of human history, migration patterns, this is terribly, terribly important.
Britain's finest unit for forensic investigation is embarking on a new and groundbreaking mission. They're experts in human identification, using the full arsenal of modern technology. But now, for the first time, they're applying these skills to bodies from the long, distant past.
It's very exciting for us to be able to take the skills that we use on a daily basis and apply them to look at historical skeletons to see just how far we can go.
Forensic anthropology, facial reconstruction, and painstaking research will open new windows on history as dramatic personal stories emerge from long forgotten bones.
Historical research is allowing me to investigate people's experiences at different times throughout history.
He certainly had a nasty crack to the top of his head. That must have been so painful.
So we've got the face, the facial reconstruction, and we've added some textures.
Fantastic. That is just superb.
This time, the cold case team is heading back into a dark corner of the 19th century, when corpses were turned into trophies and children were sold by the inch.
This just really horrible.
Yes.
Their subject, the strange mummified skeleton of a child. Its brain has been removed, its blood vessels filled with wax. A child who deserved a better fate. Can they give him back a home, a face, a name? This is History Cold Case. The Centre for Anatomy and Human Identification, part of the University of Dundee. The forensic unit is about to take on a challenging new case surrounding an extraordinary set of human remains, the mummified skeleton of a child. Its identity is a mystery. For Professor Sue Black, leader of the cold case team, this is much more than just a set of bones. It's the start of the story. With her colleague, Dr. Xanthi Malik, she begins with the first observation of the body.
Boy to look at.
Isn't he lovely?
He's beautiful.
The skeleton was donated by a colleague. Sue thinks it's over 100 years old and is some sort of anatomical specimen, dissected for the purposes of display.
A very good friend said, I brought you a present. And I thought, well, chocolates would have been nice.
Whiskey would have been
champagne
nicer.
would have been
Yeah.
fine, but, this is what we get as a present. Probably a little boy, somewhere around about 8. And I have to say, I've never seen anything like it before. I really haven't.
To transform the body, the top half of the skull has been sawn off and the chest prized open to remove internal organs. But some of the blood vessels are still preserved, carefully filled with a waxy resin.
Is he naturally mummified?
No, I don't think so. Because what if you can see, see these red bits that are sort of poking out here, these are resin. And this is a process that's called perfusion, where you place a substance into a vessel to make it stand out so that you can see it.
Until well into the 19th century, anatomists and surgeons commonly dissected and preserved human bodies as part of their training. A specimen like this one could have been used as a teaching aid.
But look at the cross. Look at the flow and the line of that. They're very artistic. And when you hold them, lift them up, it's really quite...
It's pretty solid, isn't he?
Well, it is, but it's really rather impressive that that's how he would be hanging, looking like that.
Sue never forgets that her subjects were once living people.
There is a sadness in the case. There is no doubting there is a sadness. This was somebody's son. This little boy did have a mum. Whether he had a dad at home or not, we don't know, but he certainly would have had some family. But did anybody care enough when this happened to him? Well, we don't know. I need to know who he is. I need to find that out. He needs that respect.
The initial examination confirms only the basic facts. He's a boy, probably around 8 years old. But can the cold case team discover anything about who he was, where he came from, when he lived, and of course, how he came to be hanging on a wall as some macabre display? Sue calls the first briefing.
This is what's been rather affectionately become known as the problem child of our department. So it's a little boy between 6 and 8.
Dr. Wolfram Meyer-Augenstein will hunt for chemical signatures in the boy's bones which could reveal information about where he lived and what kind of life he had. Dr. Caroline Wilkinson will perform the important task of giving the boy back his face.
Is there enough face there for you to do something with?
Yeah.
Yeah? What about the fact that there's still some soft tissue on a nose and his ears are still there?
Yeah. Who are they?
You can see one of the,
They're really,
you can see one of the blood vessels.
Sue thinks the red wax found in the boy's blood vessels could provide crucial physical clues in the case.
This resin, this wax, when you mould it, so if you take a little bit out, you put it in your fingers and you smell it. My father was a cabinet maker, so constant smell of linseed oil and waxes and those sorts of things. That's it smells like the inside of my father's furniture van. So it must be oils or wax of some kind.
Xanthi's task is to get out on the road, to gather evidence from historical records and experts in other fields, starting with the history of anatomy.
But where do you get a 7-year-old, 8-year-old boy from? At what point in history have we got access to children that we could do that to? And my mind's automatically taken back to when the anatomists had access to bodies that were coming to the anatomy departments from the poorhouses.
Bizarre as it seems to us today, Sue knows that the display of human bodies was once considered perfectly acceptable.
If I'm going to put money on any of this, I could see him late 1800s, even into the early 1900s.
The cold case investigation will focus on 3 key areas. The history. Where does our boy fit into the strange story of human dissection? The body. They will do stable isotope analysis on his bones and test a sample of resin used to preserve his blood vessels. And facial reconstruction will hopefully give him back his identity. Xanthi's first stop will be a museum collection she's heard may have some specimens that could shed light on the boy's story.
I've no idea really whether he's literally one in his own or whether there are more like him somewhere. So I'm going to go to Edinburgh and see if I can find some evidence as to how unique he might be.
Edinburgh's Surgeons' Hall Museum has housed artefacts belonging to the Royal College of Surgeons in Scotland since 1804. Here, Xanthi's meeting curator Andrew Connell, who wants to show her a bizarre collection donated by the pioneering Scottish anatomist John Barclay.
Oh, look at that. Oh, wow. Now that is a young child.
Now these are from the Barclay collection. Okay, John Barclay donated his collection to the college.
Beautifully done. Look at that, all the tiny vessels.
Yeah.
Is it possible to pick him up? Is he very delicate?
If you like to put on a pair of gloves and almost baby-like if you just support him under his spine at the back.
Yeah.
On his death in 1826, Barclay left more than 2,500 specimens, some of them children, just like our cold case.
He's quite beautiful, isn't he?
In his own way.
Again, the soft tissue of the face has been left intact, hasn't it? The nose and ears, primarily, in this case. He's amazing as well.
Many of these specimens have waxy resin in their blood vessels, just like our boy. There's one exhibit in particular that catches Xanthi's attention.
Oh, wow. He's really, really interesting and very similar to our boy, except he's got less soft tissue on his face, but visually he's very similar. Do you want me to show you our mummified boy?
So if you wanted to display a particular posture.
There we are, that's our young man.
Let's have a look at the window here. Right. Well, certainly I can see similarities between them.
I think in terms of when he would have been dissected and naturally mummified, that might be quite a similar match. 1702. Wow.
So, the Dundee case isn't the only surviving specimen of children whose bodies were turned into exhibits. But confirming the date and provenance of the Dundee mummy will involve a lot of hard science. For Sue, the next step is to take detailed measurements of the child's bones. And something doesn't add up.
What I think is happening here is that the top half of the body, the teeth and the collarbone, are telling me this is a child of about 8. The other parts of the body, so the long bones, are telling me that if this was a normal child, then they're going to be much younger, they're going to be 5. I can't believe those. Those are going to be wrong. He's got short little limbs, short little legs and short little arms, simply because there's been some disturbance. There's something going on.
The boy is several centimetres shorter than he should be for his age. To see if she can discover why, Xanthi arranges for him to be scanned at a hospital just up the road.
Jolly good.
The remains of a mummified child aren't what they're used to. The CT scanner takes a series of X-rays that can be built up into a three-dimensional picture, allowing us to see inside the child's bones. The data will hopefully reveal why the boy is significantly stunted in stature, as well as forming the starting point for Caroline's facial reconstruction.
Oh, look at that. Huh.
There you go.
Wow.
With the scan complete, the images of the boy's leg bones provide Sue with a big clue about events in his early life.
I've got on here now the foot and the lower end of the tibia and the fibula, which is just down at the ankle joint. And that very dense white line is where the bone is growing. But if you look above it, you can see just a ghostly white line that runs across above that. And there's another one above it, and another one above it, and again and again. These are the Harris lines. And what they tell us is that when that bone was growing, for whatever reason, it went into a stutter. And so that rather than laying down bone and getting bigger, it's gone into a stutter and it leaves behind a line of dense white bone. And this is telling us that this child has gone through episodes of either malnutrition or episodes of disease or something that will affect his growth. And it would be very easy to fit that picture into the workhouses of the 1800s, very, very easily. It's really rather sad, isn't it?
These Harris lines tell us that his bones stopped growing more than once during his childhood. If he was among those living in the workhouses set up in the 1830s, he could easily have lived in squalid conditions, barely surviving on starvation rations. Many who entered the workhouse died, and shocking as it may seem, the bodies often ended up on the anatomist's table. It would be a pitiful end for a small boy. But despite the emotional tug of the case, Sue has to keep her professional distance.
My job as a forensic scientist is to be able to provide objective evidence. If I become involved personally in the case, I start to have my own opinions that somebody should be found guilty, that somebody needs to pay for this, then I am no longer an objective scientist and I should be removed from that arena.
In Edinburgh, historian Owen Dudley Edwards is showing Xanthi a chilling example of a place where corpses of the poor were taken.
Now, we have to be very careful here. Very slowly.
This is very dark down here.
Isn't it? Isn't it nice?
Nice?
He's taking Xanthi into what was once a secret tunnel underneath the University of Edinburgh where dead bodies were brought in under the cover of night.
Early 19th centuries.
So this is where they would have been snuck in, basically?
Yes, well, the fact was that there was great hostility among the ordinary people of the city because they believed the doctors were killing the poor to cure the diseases of the rich. So this tunnel existed, and the bodies would be taken in secretly by night on the ground that, as it were, what the crowd didn't know wouldn't trouble them.
Despite public hostility, it seems that the harvesting of bodies was all perfectly above board. In 1832, the government had passed the Anatomy Act, which made it legal for anatomists to claim any unclaimed corpse from the workhouse. But is our boy's story really so simple? Was he donated to an anatomist for dissection under the chilling edicts of the 1832 Anatomy Act? Xanthi is following a new lead to London. The historical picture that's beginning to emerge for the boy is pulling her deeper into his story.
You're dealing with forensic cases. All your training tells you to remain objective and to actively not engage with the person you're looking at and their history and their story. But we're getting to know the little mummified boy a little bit more now, so you find yourself wondering how he would have lived, and you're engaging with him on a personal level.
Xanthi is heading to the Hunterian Museum in London, home to Britain's largest collection of human and animal specimens. Simon Chaplin is showing her an extraordinary set of exhibits.
We're surrounded, there's 3,500 specimens here. These are all the work of John Hunter.
And John Hunter was an anatomist, obviously did a lot of dissection.
He was an anatomist, he was a surgeon, he was a teacher of surgery and anatomy, but he also had a much wider interest in natural history.
John Hunter was an 18th century celebrity who entertained the London elite in his salon in Leicester Square. He was so influential, the Bishop of Durham donated his own rectum to the collection. Some of Hunter's preservations were mummified, others pickled in alcohol, like this rare specimen of an unborn horse. But Simon Chaplin let slip something that could really shake up the investigation.
This is our little boy. There you go.
The pose in this one is unusual. The raised hand is something that occurs quite often, and it harks back to earlier anatomical textbooks.
Oh, that's interesting. We haven't found anything about the position of the hand yet, and that's one of the things we thought was probably really key about this individual. So that's really probably an earlier specimen.
Well, it reminds me of 17th and early 18th century anatomical textbooks where anatomical figures were often shown with one hand raised in a kind of classical pose.
Could this be evidence that our boy in fact lived before sourcing bodies for dissection was made legal by the Anatomy Act of 1832? More clues lie in a book by John Hunter's brother, William, from 1784 which points to how widespread the appetite was for human specimens.
And he says here, I must likewise earnestly recommend it to every student to make and collect as many anatomical preparations as he can. And he goes on to say what preparations, what specimens a student to have, and he says they should have a preparation of all of the blood vessels in their natural situation and 2 preparations of the trunk of a child. In other words, exactly the kind of preparation that we've been looking at.
Absolutely, yeah.
What Simon reveals is just how sought after these specimens were before the Anatomy Act made the supply of corpses legal, and they could fetch huge sums.
I wanted to show you some of an amazing collection of auction catalogues from the late 18th, early 19th century.
Okay.
And what we have here is the catalogue of anatomical preparations, the property of a surgeon who has declined lecturing in about 1769. And if we look down here, we can see a whole subject in a wainscot case glazed with the arteries completely injected and dissected, and then lot 67, a child with the arteries injected, which sold, according to the annotation here, for £6.
If he'd been sold today, our boy could have fetched £8,500. In life, he might just have been a boy with a bleak future ahead of him, but in death, he could have been a very valuable commodity. Back in Dundee, Caroline begins the painstaking job of reconstructing the child's face. She's reconstructed the faces of the dead from Ramses II to Bach, but the boy represents a new and different challenge.
The first thing that I'll do when I look at facial reconstruction is to go through and make records, take measurements. Specifically with this one, I want to try and establish which is the soft tissue and which is the hard tissue, because that's quite difficult to see on the CT data, especially around the nose where we've got quite a lot of preserved, mummified soft tissues. I think it can be important to try and see this as a living person, because obviously there's been quite a lot of dissection that's been taken place, and there's been quite a lot of conservation of the tissues. And one of the nice things about doing a reconstruction is we should be able to see him as a living individual again. And that will as well give him back some dignity, because obviously this is relatively undignified.
It will take several more weeks before Caroline can fully reconstruct his face. At a team debrief, Xanthi updates the others about her discovery. She thinks that the anatomical books from London and the mummified children in Edinburgh could point to the boy being a much earlier specimen than they first thought.
To find out more about him, went over to the Royal College of Surgeons Museum.
Which one?
Edinburgh. And what we found was they have a number of mummified children over there.
Oh, do they?
Yeah, and this is one of them. And this is a little child. He's probably, I would say, 2 to 3 years old. These are pre the Anatomy Act.
Good heavens.
Everything will depend on forensic tests to pin down an accurate date for our boy. The results of radiocarbon dating a sample of the boy's leg bone proved inconclusive. But could they gain any information from analysing a sample of the waxy resin found in his blood vessels?
So are we saying there's a possibility of getting almost like a signature out of the resin?
Possibly.
That could match you to the person who did it?
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting.
Which is going to be the next stage.
It's a long shot. A small sample of resin will be subjected to mass spectrometry to decipher its chemical makeup. At the Hunterian Museum in London, Simon Chaplin has offered to donate a sample of resin from one of John Hunter's own specimens to see how it compares with the resin in our boy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this is an ox heart from John Hunter's collection, so from the 18th century. It's been injected. Well, we've found that these extrusions are still quite pliable, and we've taken 2 specimens here for testing.
Xanthi also needs to pinpoint the ingredients used in the various recipes for resin developed by anatomists. Simon provides the first piece of the jigsaw in a 220-year-old book.
Here we have, this is Thomas Pole's Anatomical Instructor, published in 1790. And then here, what we have is the recipe for a coarse injection, to make a red coarse injection, the kind you would need for injecting the blood vessels.
Exactly as in our mummified child, okay.
Yellow beeswax, 16 ounces. White resin, 8 ounces. Turpentine varnish, 6 ounces. Vermilion, 3 ounces. And these were very expensive artist pigments that they were using.
Oh, I see. Oh, OK, so these would have been readily available to most people. If expensive ingredients, they still would have been available to the students and the doctors.
They would have gone along to a colour shop, the kind of place that sold artist supplies, and they would have bought them there.
Oh, I see. Oh, fantastic.
More research leads to 15 different recipes for resin. The 15 recipes share 13 common ingredients. And she's found an artist supply shop which still stocks the ingredients used by anatomists 2 centuries ago. She's meeting colourman Nicholas Wold.
I'm not sure how you'd say that. Isinglass?
Isinglass.
Isinglass.
Yes, fish glue.
Fish glue?
Fish glue.
Okay.
It comes from the bladder of sturgeon.
Okay. Also, yellow beeswax. Oh, wow. Actual little pellets. Oh, it's definitely beeswax, isn't it? So that's our vermilion.
It's a wonderful colour. It's a poisonous pigment.
What does carmine look like? Wow.
Which again is an absolutely stunning colour.
Really vibrant, isn't it? Paraffin wax, Japan wax, all of these things.
Would definitely
Tallow.
have been available.
Gamboy? Is it gamboy?
Gamboge.
Gamboge. Oh, wow. Look at that. Oh.
Gamdamar, which is used for making varnish.
Okay.
That one.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Armed with all the ingredients, Xanthi can now organise the chemical analysis of our boy's resin. The results might just be able to pinpoint when and where he was originally preserved. In Dundee, our child's face is beginning to come back to life.
Well, the first thing we needed to do, obviously, was to add the missing bit of the cranium. And what we've done there is we've taken in a template of a similar aged and ethnicity skull that we already have in our database, and have morphed that to fit this skull, to fit with the contours of this skull. What I've also done is to copy the missing area of the supraorbital bone on the right-hand side and flipping it and putting it above the right orbit. Also, just because it looks a little strange, I filled the hole that's on the frontal bone on the forehead there, which was a mounting hole.
With the skull complete, Caroline can start adding some of the facial features.
Now with the eyeballs, we can import spheres of approximately the right size, which is about 22 millimetres in diameter for someone of this age. In order to recreate the nose, I've taken measurements of the width of the nose and some measurements of the nasal aperture. So what I've then been able to do is to import a nose model and alter it to fit this particular skull. And we can also see in profile that we use those 2 tangents to tell us the most projecting point on the nose. We can see by the angle of them that this individual would have a concave nasal root, which means a curve, an upward curve to the nose, which is also very common in individuals of this age. Most children have little upturned noses. I think you can start to see what he's going to look like. So as soon as we start to see some of his facial features, then we can look at him as a boy rather than a specimen.
Caroline now needs the results of Wolfram's stable isotope tests, which could confirm the theory that the child was malnourished.
It doesn't give us any information about facial features. It won't make any difference to the shape of the face, but what it will do is enable us to choose which tissue depth data to use, whether to use emaciated, normal or overweight. And I'm waiting to find out that.
The analysis involves sampling a small section of the boy's leg bone. Wolfram is particularly interested in the relative values of isotopes of nitrogen and carbon found in the collagen part of the bone. Called stable isotope testing, this process can reveal crucial information about a person's background.
Largely it can say, where does someone come from? It can then tell us perhaps something about their diet, what sort of diet they had. Were they herbivores? Were they carnivores? Was it a mixture of that? And when you know the diet, then that gives you some indication of a social status as well. So really those are the three things. The geography, where the person comes from, a bit about the diet, and then we can infer from that maybe a bit of the social status.
While Wolfram hunts for answers about the boy's diet, Xanthi continues her mission. Now armed with a third sample of resin from the Edinburgh mummies prepared by John Barclay, she's come to Northumbria University, where all three samples of resin will be tested.
Hello.
Right.
Pleased to meet you at last.
I was hoping you can tell me a little bit about the waxy resin that we took out from the mummified child through his arterial system.
The 13 ingredients she picked up in the artist's supply shop will provide the baseline samples for the mass spectrometer. Meanwhile, in Dundee, Sue and her student Scott used some of the ingredients to actually recreate the waxy resin from an 18th century recipe. They're cooking up a mixture of beeswax, pine resin and turpentine. It may be the first time this has been done in a couple of centuries.
Perhaps if we do it very gently.
Gently.
Yeah. So that it's a slow and gradual process. And then at the very last minute, what we're going to do is put the vermilion in. Oh, look. Oh. It does actually look very like blood. You can see why they've used that, can't you?
Thomas Pole's book of 1790 also advises on the best sort of body to use.
And it says, for this purpose, which is injecting, adult subjects are seldom used. Oh, how interesting. On the account of the difficulty in completely filling the vessels with injection. So the suggestion there is that to do this article, it's normally done on children.
Sue isn't content with just making up a recipe. She wants to inject it into a blood vessel and see how it works. In this case, it's a pig's aorta from a local butcher's.
If we try and suck it up. Okay. It is a bit. If you can leave that, if you can hold up the aorta, let's see if we can inject it in. Now watch, because it might be quite hot. Let's just try. Oh, if we can get a flow going.
You can feel that hardening quite a
Can
bit
you?
down towards the bottom.
Excellent. Not burning your fingers, that, is it?
Nope.
In terms of the injection, that's not going to take much more because it's right at the top there.
Push some more down.
And then it says, yep, it says put it in cold water then.
Okay.
Which is what's supposed to solidify it.
I don't think I'll need much help, to be honest.
No. It's quite hard. Yeah, it's quite hard. If you take a plug of it out, for example, look, that's the sort of thing that we were finding inside his blood vessels. It does work.
The last of the forensic tests are now in, so Sue assembles the team. Wolfram has drawn a blank in terms of pinpointing where the boy comes from, but has found something exciting from the nitrogen values in the bone sample.
Cut a long story short, all the nitrogen values point at somebody who had definitely not a protein deficient diet. Whether the protein came from lots of cheese and whatever, cream cheese or lots of milk, I don't know, or whether it came from meat or fish or poultry, but it was definitely not meat deficient.
So this is not a pauper's diet, is it?
Unless the diet in almshouses and paupers' houses was much better than we give them credit for.
No.
Such a protein-rich diet means our child is unlikely to have lived and died in a workhouse. And it would follow unlikely to have been the victim of the 1832 Anatomy Act. The stunted growth that Sue discovered in his bones could have been a result of disease. No one was immune to the epidemics like whooping cough and measles that raged through the population. The news that our boy was well nourished means Caroline can press on with recreating his face.
From my point of view, in terms of the amount of tissue depth we can use for the facial reconstruction, then the best thing for me to do is to use the average. There's no point in using emaciated. No.
It's now time for Xanthi to drop her own bombshell. She's got the data back from the tests on the resin in the boy's blood vessels.
We sourced a sample of the Berkeley collection and the Hunter collection so they actually could compare them.
Gave you a sample of
yes.
it? Good grief.
Yes.
Well done.
So we had more than just the recipe to go on because there would have been some variation as people kind of tweaked it, just like any recipe.
Absolutely. So the Hunter materials all in London?
London.
The Berkeley material?
Edinburgh, yes. Right. So out of the two that they were compared to, it was Hunter that was the closest.
Good grief.
But it was close enough that it could have been a slight variation on Hunter's own recipe. So, I mean, long shot, but it could have been on Hunter himself that did the actual dissection.
So when you go to the Hunterian Museum, is there something else that matches this?
Comparable, no.
So that what you could be looking at, for argument's sake, if we were absolutely going to take this to the limit, is the first and only example belonging to the Hunterian collection.
Yeah.
Of this
Surviving.
kind of a presentation.
Yeah, possibly.
Outrageous.
Yes.
That makes it very, very important.
Yeah.
So our boy could be one of the first examples of this kind of specimen. And the result that his resin is similar to one of John Hunter's recipes would place our boy in a time well before the 1832 Anatomy Act made obtaining bodies legal.
We're looking at late 18th century, early 19th century, in London, an anatomical specimen, a child that's not particularly undernourished. We're not looking at a poorhouse child.
No.
What's happening in London on the anatomical scene at that time?
Before the Anatomy Act.
Before the Anatomy Act.
There was no legal way of obtaining children.
Was it illegal?
Well,
that's the question. You need to speak to somebody who has a good understanding of the anatomical society within London of that time, a good historian.
If our boy was illegally sourced to be experimented on, this is a major turning point.
What's happening in this case is that we've thought this is going to be a post-1832. No, it's not. It's a pre-1832. Completely different set of evidence, completely different path that we want to go down. So you can't predict when something is going to change, and this case has given us quite a number of twists and turns that we just simply couldn't have anticipated.
Does a boy, well-nourished and from London, point to an even darker side of the history of anatomy? Is he a victim of a period when the demand for dead bodies far outstripped the legal supply? When the grave robber was society's bogeyman. Xanthi's about to find out. She's back in London at the Royal College of Surgeons, where she's discovered that they have first-hand evidence that bodies like our boys were stolen. She's meeting archivist Louise King.
Okay, so this is a diary of a resurrectionist from 1811 to 1812. It just covers a few months.
And resurrectionist would have been?
Grave robber, essentially.
Okay. February 2nd.
Went to look out, met at 5 in the evening, went to the green, got 7 large and 3 small and 3 fetus.
Same night, went to
Wisegate?
Something like that, Wygate, yeah. 4 large and 2 small. Took them to Bartholomew's. So he's going and basically digging up graves, taking 7 large, so 7 adults, I guess, or 7 large children.
No, I think large he tends to
okay.
use for adults,
3 children and 3 fetuses.
Yeah.
So he's looking probably for newly buried, newly covered graves.
I mean, as I understand it, they had lookouts who would let them know that there'd been burials.
A new burial,
yeah.
And what was potentially being buried.
Yeah.
So it's almost like a shopping list.
Yeah.
And then taking them to hospitals for the dissection.
That's right, yes.
Wow. And this is the only book of its kind like this?
As far as we know, yes, it is.
Oh, how odd, isn't it? Just saying like 7 large and 3 small.
Yeah.
Oh.
It's a fantastic piece of evidence, but this diary is just one man's account. To find out more, Xanthi must immerse herself in the world of the Resurrectionist. Will she be able to place our boy in this dark and largely unexplored chapter of British history? In Dundee, armed with the information that the boy had a healthy diet, Caroline is beginning the process of adding flesh to the bone.
I've placed these pegs on that represent the tissue depths. Now, because we found out that this individual wasn't emaciated, didn't have a starvation diet, we've used contemporary 7-8-year-old measurements from a British population. And that really helps us, after we've done the muscle structure, to put the correct amount of tissue over and above the muscles. So the next thing is to import each of the facial muscles and distort it and deform it to fit this particular skull.
Caroline uses haptic or tactile technology that allows her to mimic the experience of building a face from clay. A mechanical arm gives her the sensation of feeling the surface of the head she's reconstructing.
When you touch something on the computer screen, it gives you this what's called haptic feedback. So in other words, you can feel what you're touching on the screen. It enables you to do things with speed, but also look back at what's underneath as well, which is something you can't do with real clay. Once you put a muscle in place, you can't then have a look at the bone underneath again. So this system allows you to constantly check what you've done. So it's kind of exciting working with new technology like this.
Having placed all the muscles, she can now add the tissue. Everything she's done so far is based on the scientific information the team has gathered.
I'd say that the areas where there's most artistic interpretation will be the final additions related to age and texture and colour and hair and all those details that we don't know from the skull.
The facial reconstruction is almost complete. Caroline is on the verge of showing us the face of our boy. In London, Xanthi's digging deeper into the sordid history of the grave robbers. She's come to the very heart of the city to meet author Sarah Wise, who spent 5 years researching the world of the Resurrectionist.
What I'm hoping that Sarah might be able to give me some insight into is how common this was. I mean, if she's got any information which could help us, that's what I'm hoping for. And just
lead us down that path towards learning more about his identity, really.
Sarah wants to show Xanthi a London street that runs from the Old Bailey to Smithfield Market. This was the centre for a lucrative trade in fresh corpses driven by demand from nearby medical schools. Every student going through the schools needed at least one body to practice on, so the demand was high. Some of the corpses were mummified for display.
So why have we come here specifically?
This whole stretch really was the centre of the resurrection trade north of the river in London in the early 19th century. Just going to take you up here and show you St Sepulchre's Church. And in 1791, they were so worried about the amount of bodies that were going missing from the graveyard that used to be over the back, that they did what many people, even in small villages, they'd club together and by themselves construct a watch house. So this watch house looked out over onto the graveyard of St Sepulchre, which was at the back.
So specifically to stop the resurrectionists coming in and stealing the bodies?
That's right, but unfortunately a watch house was really only as useful as the man who was running it. And one of the other reasons that body snatching was able to flourish for so long was that a lot of the sextons, the watchmen, were corrupt and for significant payment would, well, not just turn a blind eye, but would open the gates and help.
That's really grim, isn't it?
It's really vile. It's absolutely horrible.
Across the road is the reason why this graveyard was particularly at risk.
So over on the right we've got St Bartholomew's Hospital, which was one of the largest teaching hospitals in London and very much in need of as many bodies that the body snatchers could supply them with. So much so that they would the porters would leave hampers, large hampers, outside or within their courtyard for the snatchers to run over, pick up the hamper in order to bring their corpses from here over to there. Because this was the site of the Fortune of War pub, which was the major meeting place and safe house for body snatchers north of the river.
All that remains now is a chilling inscription.
The landlord used to show the room where, on benches round the walls, the bodies were placed, labelled with the snatchers' names, wait until the surgeons at St Bartholomew's could run around and appraise them. Oh wow! This was not exactly, you know, underground then, was it? This was...
It was very out in the open.
So this was a good, lucrative trade.
Very much so.
But was our boy simply stolen from a graveyard? Or was his fate even darker? In a former Resurrectionist pub next to Smithfield Market, Sarah reveals just how far some body snatchers were willing to go.
I'd like to show you a document. It's a confession taken the day before his execution from a very prolific body snatcher called John Bishop.
The document explains how Bishop and his accomplice lured a 14-year-old boy from a Smithfield pub back to his house.
We lighted a candle and gave the boy some bread and cheese, and after he'd eaten, we gave him a cupful of rum with about half a small phial of laudanum in it.
That's a tincture of opium.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Was it illegal then?
Laudanum wasn't at all illegal, and in fact, many people in the 19th century used it quite openly and respectably as a sort of tonic or pick-me-up or, you know, some sort of relaxant.
The boy quickly passed out.
We took him directly, asleep and insensible, into the garden, tied a cord to his feet to enable us to pull him up by, and then I took him in my arms and let him slide from them headlong into the well in the garden, whilst Williams held the cord to prevent the body going altogether too low into the well. He was nearly wholly in the water of the well, his feet just above the surface. Williams fastened the other end of the cord around the paling to prevent the body getting beyond our reach. The boy struggled a little with his arms and legs in the water, and the water bubbled for a minute.
Oh, this is just really horrible.
Yes. They tricked this little boy. They got him drunk, partially drunk. They drugged him. They drowned him.
Yes.
and consequently they had an extremely fresh body to start touting around to the surgeons the next morning, which is exactly what they did, and it's exactly what led to their arrest. Unfortunately, it was not the first time they'd behaved in that way. James May, who was his co-defendant at the Old Bailey, he shouted across the bishop, "You're a bloody murdering bastard and you should have been topped," i.e. hanged, years ago, which indicates strongly that May believed that Bishop had been murdering for years. And the other strange thing, Xanthi, is that the body was in fact noted, and the word that was used was stout. This boy was not sort of emaciated, he hadn't gone hungry. Oh, that is interesting. Wow.
Records prove that Bishop snatched up to 1,000 bodies, and he and his gang may have murdered many more than the 3 victims he confessed to in and around Smithfield Market. The panic unleashed by the Bishop case of 1831 highlighted the disappearance of thousands of children, many of them as young as our boy.
I had no idea that the area surrounding Smithfield Market, where all of the meat trades take part, this is the centre of the human meat trade. Children were being sourced here literally for murder to furnish the anatomists. And it's a shocking and horrifying end for these lives.
Whatever the fate of our 8-year-old child, once handed over to the anatomists, he quickly became faceless and anonymous. But the team is about to give him back his identity. The team's forensic evidence and historical research have revealed that our mummy is an 8-year-old boy who they believe died in London before the Anatomy Act of 1832, which made acquiring dead bodies legal. He was well nourished, but he had lived through periods of ill health. He was either a freshly buried corpse dug up by grave robbers, or he was murdered, like the boy in the Bishop confession.
It's like he picked up this boy, took him home and killed him.
Yeah. Wait till he got a bit sleepy.
Yeah.
Chuck him in the well.
I just think it's getting more tragic as we go along this tale. It started out as an anatomical specimen, and then we kind of realised it was, you know,
illegally obtained.
It was a boy, and that it may have been illegally obtained, and now it's looking more likely it's a murder, and all for the sake of an anatomical specimen.
But that's anatomy's history.
I know, it's just this particular case I didn't expect it to head in that direction.
But were you ever going to have a happy outcome with a dissected 7-year-old? Anatomy has a very, very murky past, and we know it's got a murky past. And ultimately, I think he's a representation of that murky past.
The time has come for Caroline to reveal the final piece of the jigsaw.
So we've got the facial reconstruction, and we've taken that and added some textures. He's been given quite, not neutral, but common hair colour and eye colour, and references from that period of time in terms of hairstyle have been used. Okay, so this is just a still.
Actually, a very nice looking boy.
That's good. I like that.
But the reveal and the end of the investigation presents the team with a dilemma.
We've got to decide, I suppose, what we do with them now.
Yep.
And I think there are three choices that I can see. It remains in the department
We've never been happy
under
with that.
circumstances which I don't think are appropriate.
No. Okay, so that's
We ask the Hunterian Museum or whichever whether they would be prepared to house the specimen appropriately, but with a full story as to how this has unfolded, or we decide he goes back into the ground.
Maybe we have an opportunity here to educate people about that
Do you want him
darker
to become
side.
an educational specimen?
Oh, now you make me sound really hard.
I don't like display cabinets. I never really have, I must admit. So if we have any doubt,
we bury him.
Then you bury him. Then I think our decision is that he should be buried.
Would you have felt the same before you saw his face?
Yes. Wouldn't have made any difference. Because I do feel very, very strongly about human remains. And I do feel very strongly about their display. And as an anatomist, I feel a responsibility.
After more than 170 years, the History Cold Case team has given our 8-year-old boy back his face and his dignity. For Sue, the case of the mummified child can now be closed.
I think the fact that in this case we've gone from something about which we knew absolutely nothing to a point now that we can almost pinpoint him down in time, that we know which anatomy house he's most closely related to, and we can start to place him within the context of that time. That's an incredible achievement in a very short space of time. And I must admit, it's not something that for a moment, if I'd been honest at the outset, I didn't think we were going to get very far. We have gone much, much further than I could ever have anticipated. This is just about as good as it gets.
Britain's finest unit for forensic investigation is embarking on a new and groundbreaking mission. As experts in human identification, they use the full arsenal of modern technology. But now, for the first time, they're applying these skills to bodies from the long, distant past.
It's very exciting for us to be able to take the skills that we use on a daily basis and apply them to look at historical skeletons to see just how far we can go.
Forensic anthropology, facial reconstruction, and painstaking research will open new windows on history as dramatic personal stories emerge from long forgotten bones.
Historical research is allowing me to investigate people's experiences at different times throughout history.
Probably a little boy, somewhere around about 8. And I have to say, I've never seen anything like it before.
So we've got the face, the facial reconstruction, and we've added some textures.
Fantastic. That is just superb.
This time, the team hunts for the identity of a mysterious skeleton unearthed at Stirling Castle.
He certainly had a nasty crack to the top of his head.
His body reveals new information about one of the bloodiest periods in our history.
It's just horrendous. That must have been so painful.
When the Scottish and the English were engaged in total war. The forensic trail leads to an extraordinary document.
It could be our man. Yes. Ooh, okay.
Can the team give one of history's cold cases a home, A face, a name. This is History Cold Case. Stirling Castle. Perched on an extinct volcano and strategically placed near the gateway to the Highlands, was for centuries the front line during the Scottish Wars of Independence. Perhaps this offers us our first clue to unlocking a mystery that has remained unsolved for 6 centuries. During 1997, archaeologists excavated a group of skeletons that had lain in a forgotten room underneath the castle for over 600 years. A find made more unusual and rare as it wasn't common practice to bury people within the walls of the castle. One of these bodies, a powerful man in the prime of his life, has unusual wounds to his skull. Now, the History Cold Case team will collaborate with Historic Scotland, the keeper of the skeletons, to open an investigation into who the man was and why he was there. Could his story shed new light into Stirling's turbulent history? Dr. Xanthi Mallet from the Centre of Anatomy and Human Identification is coming to collect the skeletons and meet Historic Scotland's chief archaeologist, Peter Yeoman.
So this is our archaeology store where we keep all the finds from all the excavations that we've been involved with over the last 40 years. And all the Stirling material that we're looking at is just these.
Okay, so some of it's quite fragmented then.
Yeah, it's not in bad condition, but there's obviously lots of little bits.
Yeah.
But also I've got another thing to show you as well, a fascinating object that was found with the young man. It's an arrowhead.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not much is known about the arrow or the bones, originally dated as 14th or 15th century. It's time for the Cold Case team to get to work.
It's fantastic, yeah. I think the team are going to be really excited to have a look at these and see where we want to go next with it and what we can find out. There's certainly lots of different forensic techniques we're going to be able to apply. So it's going to be really exciting.
Open up and lay them out.
The investigation will be led by forensic anthropologist Professor Sue Black, based at the Centre for Anatomy and Human Identification, part of the University of Dundee. The case starts with an observation of the bones.
Thoracic. Sacrum in pieces. Okay, that gives us an H clue.
And she's already spotted something highly unusual.
Don't know that you've seen what sits on the top of the skull? Ooh!
Ooh, what do you think that is?
Well,
Axe?
If you can see on the frontal bone here, which is just coming down the side of the forehead, there's a very deep groove. And that groove shows that the outer table, because the bones of the skull act like a sandwich. So there's an outer layer of bone, an inner layer of bone, and a bit of filling in the middle. And what's happened is that there's been damage to the outer layer, but it's not penetrated through to the inner layer. So we've not gone in and damaged brain or blood vessels or anything like that. But he's certainly had a nasty crack to the top of his head. But it's healed, so this happened long before he died.
The bones reveal that our man was between 25 and 40 years old. And there are more signs of trauma, this time to his face.
Those teeth have had a rattle at some point or another. They've set up abscesses in there.
Yeah.
There's going to be some form of an impact. Not enough to have broken a face, for example, but you get a smack in the front of your face, then both of these teeth are going to rattle. And that's what's happened. It's loosened the teeth enough that what happens is the bacteria can get into the space that it can't normally get into and sets up an infection, which is what you have in terms of the abscess.
But although he was clearly a victim of violence, He was well equipped to dole it out as well.
But
Still,
Syphilis
yeah.
is quite well developed. So I think muscle-wise, he's got good sites of muscle development lower limb, but they're exceptional upper limb.
Absolutely.
Yeah, he's a big bruiser in that regard. When you look at the back of the scapula, the shoulder blade, you can see that there's a trough runs down there. That's because this bone is about surface area. That's about muscles attaching. And if you've got a bigger muscle, you need more surface area. So what you do is you undulate the bone and you give the bone more surface area. And look at that trough. There's just a huge dip going in there. And I don't know that I've actually ever seen it this extensive. He's a big bruiser.
Yeah, he's a big boy.
He's got his story. We just started to unravel it. I always say it's like a knitted jumper, that somewhere you've got to start and find a thread. If you can just keep going, you can unravel the whole thing.
Sue gathers the other experts who will work with her and Xanthi on the investigation.
We're going to start, first of all, with what we need to find out about him historically.
Okay,
and
so
his place
historical
of
context.
burial, the context of it.
For his bones to show signs of such big muscle development means whatever this man did for a living, he had done from a very young age. So explaining his physique will be crucial. They also need to narrow down possible dates for our man's death. And Dr. Caroline Wilkinson will painstakingly reconstruct his face.
We can scan the skull, try and put it back together. We could also do a reconstruction of his upper body in relation to his head as well.
Okay.
We've done it before.
Dr. Wolfram Meyer-Orgenstein will try to discover more about where our man lived and died from chemical signatures in his bones.
I'd like to have a mid-shaft diaphysis.
Mid-shaft diaphysis, femur. Okay.
Yeah.
Now the hard science begins. Bone analysis to find out what our man ate and where he was from. Bone scanning to begin the process of facial reconstruction. They also need to discover the significance of a tantalizing artifact found with the body, a single arrowhead.
His life was clearly interesting because he's got a number of incidents that have clearly happened to him throughout his life. He's got an intriguing period that says, how did he die? Was this arrowhead that's found in association with him part of the death? And then what's happened to him afterwards is also interesting. So that why was he buried where he was? Was that an indication of his status? So he's one of those individuals where all three parts of that process are going to tell you something interesting and something different. Who was he in life? How did he die? Why was he treated the way he was?
Xanthi's job is to try and add to the profile of our man through historical research. First step, back to the place where his body was found. Archaeologist Gordon Hewitt has been fascinated by the Stirling man ever since he discovered him here in 1997. The castle itself could provide crucial clues. The trail begins in Stirling's Great Hall, built for James IV in around 1503.
This is the Great Hall.
Wow.
Stirling Castle.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
It's massive.
Yeah, it is.
At the front line of repeated English invasions in the 13th and 14th centuries, Stirling Castle changed hands many times during the sieges and battles of the Scottish Wars of Independence.
Many sort of festivities, and as well as the works of government were enacted here. And these tapestries are, give an indication, anyway, of the kind of lavish quality of the court.
Would they have had tapestries and things hanging on the walls?
I think so, very much so.
Underneath the rooms of the 18th century kitchens, Gordon found the remains of a long-forgotten building.
And here we are in one of the rooms of the governor's kitchen.
He thinks this area could be the remains of what was once a medieval chapel.
This is the area where the actual mature male was buried. When you actually look at the photographs, which I can show you.
Oh, fantastic. You can see the injury on the skull
That's
there.
right, that's right.
Why would he have been buried here?
In normal circumstances, a burial would be completed preferably at the parish church from whence they came. They would only have been buried here in exceptional circumstances.
But our cold case wasn't alone. 10 other bodies, including a female, were unearthed at the same site.
It's hard to imagine your average man-at-arms or
Okay.
household servant being
So they wouldn't
interred
have been
here.
just anyone. To
No.
be buried in here, they would
No.
have had to have been of relative significance to
I think that's fair to say.
the family.
That's right.
Okay.
To be buried in a chapel inside Stirling Castle, our man must have been of high status. Taken along with his physique, could he have been part of an elite fighting force? Warfare medieval style was led by knights on horseback, the elite warrior class of Europe. Knighthood wasn't just conferred by the monarch, it had to be earned on the battlefield. Knights lived and died by the shared values of the chivalric code: courage, piety, and loyalty to your king. In Dundee, the team is taking samples of teeth and bone from the skeleton. One goes for carbon dating, and another goes to Dr. Wolfram Meyer-Orgenstein, the team's stable isotope expert. These are ancient remains, so there are no guarantees, but Sue is confident.
There is nobody else that I would trust for a forensic investigation. He is the best that there is, and he has not only a national reputation, he has a huge international reputation.
Wolfram will be hunting for trace minerals in the molar tooth, which is formed in the first 15 years of life. These could reveal where he spent his early years, and samples from the thigh bone, which regenerates during a lifetime, could tell us about his diet as an adult. Next, to the local Ninewells Hospital for a CT scan to see inside the man's bones. The scan might yield valuable information about his life and death. It will also provide the accurate data needed to reconstruct his face and body. Caroline Wilkinson has drafted in her colleague, Caroline Needham, to produce a full-body reconstruction of the man. To begin, they examine the skull.
At the moment, I'm just assessing the skull to see how much of it is here, how much of it we're going to have to reassemble, and when we've done that, how much will be missing still that we can remodel. Actually, it looks like there's quite a lot here. There's more than it looked like on the images because we've got a lot of fragments. And messy as that looks, we can actually manage to put most of them back together. We can reassemble the skull in the computer, so we can take scan data from this skull and import each fragment into the computer and then reassemble it. I mean, the beauty of the computer is there's no gravity, so you can put a skull piece there and it'll stay, it doesn't fall. We can tell by looking at this jaw, this is a big, strong, hefty jaw. It's got very strong muscle attachments here, so he would have had a big, square jaw, heavy-duty face. lower half of the face. But then we've also got quite strong brow ridges at the top, so he's going to have a heavy brow, more deep-set eyes. I mean, it's very typically male skull. Oh, I love skulls like this, not spits. It's my favourite thing, reassembling them.
Each of the fragments has to be individually and painstakingly scanned using a small mobile scanner. With the hospital CT scan, these measurements will make a complete skull. The face that Caroline foresees seems to fit perfectly with Sue's assessment of the body. Heavy-browed, muscly, square-jawed, a man perfectly formed to live and die by the sword. The first test results are coming in from the labs. Radiocarbon dating is the key dating test for bone. One type of carbon, carbon-14, deteriorates at a constant rate once it is laid down in the bone. Measuring the amount of decay establishes the age of the skeleton. It's a difficult process that isn't always successful, but this time the team have a clear result. The Stirling cold case died between 1290 and 1400. That means he lived during the height of the Scottish Wars of Independence, when the English were repeatedly trying to conquer the country and the Scots were driving them back. From Stirling Castle, perched on a steep cliff, Scottish armies could survey the fields below. 10 miles north of here, the powerful River Forth marks the beginning of the Highlands, so the castle and the open fields around it saw the bloodiest conflicts. Xanthi is meeting medieval warfare expert Scott McMaster.
This is a picture of his crania. Now you can quite clearly see there, that's a healed sharp force trauma to...
Yeah, absolutely, at the back of the head.
Yeah, I mean, is that kind of wound you'd recognise?
It's very common in the medieval period. This could be an axe or a sword, perhaps, or even a club. He's obviously perhaps been a knight or a man-at-arms, anyway, judging by the weaponry.
Very robust in his upper body, especially, very robust.
Right, OK. Well, it's quite common for sort of bruisers, so to speak, in this period.
Yeah, that's how I kind of imagined him.
The Scots, sometimes supported by the French, managed to defeat the invading English army on a number of occasions. But the victories of William Wallace and Robert the Bruce weren't enough to keep them permanently at bay. Stirling Castle was occupied by English forces at least 8 times during our man's lifetime.
The castle certainly changed hands over this period and several times.
Right.
So whether he was, this individual in particular was maybe perhaps involved in a siege, or if he was actually, he died later on of wounds perhaps during one of these battles, it's a very strong possibility.
It's not clear yet which side our man was on. English, Scottish, or even French. But he was definitely part of the conflict. But what about the other bodies found with him? Can they shed any light onto the investigation? Sue and Xanthi are about to examine one of them. The only woman found among the bodies, she too has mysterious wounds on her head.
Okay, so... what are these? 2 of them. You got one there and you got one there.
Yeah.
You've got...
That is approximately the same shape as that there.
Who's that? What on earth are they? Bloody hell. They're very square. That is incredibly clean to go through there. So that whatever it was a significant amount of force with a sharp edge.
Yeah, otherwise it would have shattered.
Otherwise it would have shattered. So I think you need to find someone who knows something about this, because I know absolutely nothing.
No, not me.
It doesn't make sense.
Sue and Xanthi have no idea what the 2 puncture marks in the skull could mean. But Dr. Joe Buckbury, a biological anthropologist from Bradford University, is an expert in skull trauma.
What's really interesting is a rectangular hole penetrating through the skull. The edges are quite clear. There's a little area in here that's just sort of spalling away, which could have been caused by a weapon coming out. And then on the inside, what you might be able to see is that the hole is actually much larger on the inside. That's called internal beveling, and that's a really strong indication that this happened around the time of death. So I immediately thought this was quite interesting and could well be battle trauma. But I think there was also some more trauma to the side of her head in here. If I take these pieces of bone, they actually fit quite tightly. And I think there's been another blow around the time of death in here with a radiating fracture from the force of the blow coming up around here. I wonder whether or not she was hit on the side of the head with quite a blunt object, fell to the ground, and then after that the 2 square injuries were sustained on the top of her head.
Jo thinks she knows the kind of weapon that killed the Stirling woman.
Well, the weapon I'm holding now is a 16th century flanged mace that a member of staff at the Royal Armouries has given me because it's got quite a rectangular cross-section which might possibly match the injury we're seeing on this skull.
Jo demonstrates that the marks on a florist sponge made by the mace are identical to those on the woman's skull. Were the wars of Scottish independence so overwhelming that women were caught up in the conflict as well? Xanthi has come to Dunbar on the east coast of Scotland, near the remains of the town's medieval castle. She's meeting historian Chris Brown. He's not surprised by the wounds in the woman's skull.
So this is the woman I've come to talk to you about today. And these are the injuries to her skull. What we're looking at here is the back of her crania, so the back of her head. And you've got 2 distinct injuries here. So are these the kind of injuries you'd expect to see in battle, and if so, on a woman?
Absolutely, totally typical injuries.
Really?
Exactly the sort of wound you'd expect to get, and no reason to assume that women are in any way completely isolated from war in the Middle Ages.
Here at Dunbar in the 14th century, the Countess of Moray defeated a violent English attack. Black Agnes, as she's known, was a fearless defender of her castle.
This is probably the clearest and finest example of a woman engaged in war in Scotland in the Middle Ages. The woman in question is called Agnes of Dunbar, or Black Agnes, and she commanded a siege here for 5 months.
Oh, really?
19 weeks solid.
Here, in this castle?
Right where we are. She was in her mid-20s, about 25, 26
Really?
years old. Her husband wasn't present, the Earl of Dunbar. He's busy fighting the English in other parts of Scotland. And the castle comes under siege. She's on site. Of course, she's in charge.
Black Agnes's battle was just one in the long and bloody war. It seems that Scottish men and women took up arms and died to defend the cause of their independence. But was our Stirling cold case friend or foe? Did he defend the castle, or did he attack it? Can his bones yield any more clues? Sue and Xanthi take a closer look at the skeleton.
What else have we got? Oh, we definitely got problems on his left ankle. If you look on the talus, heel sits like that, talus sits on top. If you look at the talus, there's a very well-defined area of damage. So that would have been filled with possibly pus, but certainly enough space-occupying tissue to cause bone damage. It will have not been pleasant to walk on because the entirety of your body weight passes down through that ankle joint. That's painful.
But the injuries don't stop there.
There are some vertebrae that are a little bit unusual, but I don't think those are normal aging changes. I think those are trauma and path changes. And if you open that one and look at it, can you see that ridge that runs around there? That's not normal.
No, so he's had some sort of trauma, something's happened to...
Yeah. episodes of damage have occurred, whether that's as a result of activity. It's not a systemic disease because that's not something that's being evident throughout this.
Yeah.
But there's localized and little focal areas where bone is damaged, broken down, showing it's trying to repair itself, not fracture necessarily.
So, back trauma and an abscess on his ankle. When you put these injuries together with his physique, what are they telling us?
When you've got somebody who is obviously very well developed, like he is, but not symmetrically so in the top and the bottom half of his body. So he's doing something different with the bottom half of his body compared to what he's doing with the top half of his body. So if, for example, the obvious thing would be, if we think he was a knight, for example, is he sitting on a horse? And I think, quite justifiably, that would be something that we could look at.
As the historical research and the science start to converge, a clear profile is emerging of a strong man somewhere between 25 and 40, a survivor of heavy blows to the head, of sufficient rank to be buried within the walls of Stirling Castle, but soon needs more historical research to tie up the evidence. She wants to prove he was a knight, a member of the military elite of medieval Europe. The rituals of medieval knighthood weren't buried with them. Jousting tournaments, lavish displays of might, wealth and skill were almost as dangerous as the battlefield. Xanthi is meeting David Mitchell and Jeremy Richardson of the Knights of Royal England, who are keeping these rituals alive.
Right, this is a chainmail top. Okay, we won't ask you to put it on. I don't know how you want to, if you want to put your arm out a little bit.
Right. Oh, bloody hell. This is really heavy, isn't it?
Yeah. Now, of course, at that time, there would have been very little armour around, so all your protection really would have come from the chainmail.
Right.
Let me give you a helmet.
Right.
A metal helmet. This is actually a tilting helmet.
That's pretty heavy as well.
It's metal. It's really going to it'll take a blow to the face.
Yeah. So this is going to build up all the muscles down your neck, across your shoulders.
Yeah. That he would have been training with armour and chainmail since he was sort of 14, 14,
really?
15.
So even as his muscles and bones were developing, he would have been carrying this kind of weight. So
Well, try the helmet on. Just see what your vision's like in the helmet.
I've got a guess that it's not going to be very good. Okay.
It's not the best, but it will protect you.
Okay, I can't see anything, really.
I can't hear you. Sorry.
Yeah,
we
funny
can't hear
that. I can't even see.
Right, weapons. Jousting shield, so you would wear that on your left arm, and then we've got a lance
Oh, you
for
are
you.
kidding. Right, okay.
Mind you don't bang him on the head.
Yeah.
Right, and that lance would cross over the other side of the horse, so you try and attack your opponent, you try and have your opponent coming, on this side, side of you, because you've got your shield on that side, so that will be the protection.
I don't think I'd have been very good at this. Okay,
Right. Let me take the lance from you. I'll take the lance and the shield.
Thank you.
The sheer weight of armour and weapons designed to be used on horseback explains the muscle imbalance between the upper and lower torso. But can our jousters explain the mouth, ankle and back injuries?
He would have had trouble walking, that and been in some discomfort. How he developed that, I don't know, but it was showing in both the ankle bones and the lower leg bones.
Well, presumably, having done it, presumably that would be a fall, a horse going down. If your foot stays in the stirrup, the actual stirrup itself damages your ankle.
Okay, the other injuries that he had, he'd had a knock to the front of his mouth here, so his teeth were loose. Yeah, you're nodding here. Had that?
We've done that once.
Yeah, okay.
I would probably,
Jousting,
said a lance in the face. And the back injury is sort of an interesting one. I guess it could have been a fall. There could have been something that happened with the fall, but also excessive riding does your back in.
Yeah, so all of these injuries are consistent with him being a horse rider and also a knight in jousting and taking part in these types of events. He is more robust in the right-hand side, so that may be a result of the jousting and the sword play. Everything active and kind of overt is with the right-hand side. Defensively, he's well built on the left-hand side because he's got the shield. So it all fits with the profile that we've got, and I'm happy now to think that he is a knight on horseback.
Back in Dundee, Sue summons the team.
Wolfram, you've got some new dietary information.
The first results of Wolfram's isotopic testing have come through, with surprising results. It looks like our cold case wasn't the meat-eating carnivore that we might expect from a medieval warrior.
We looked at the bone. We found 30% marine-derived protein intake or food intake and 70% terrestrial.
He's eating a lot of saltwater fish, a much higher proportion than we eat today, and yet Stirling Castle is miles from the sea.
For God's sake, the man's in Stirling. It's not on a coastline.
Has nothing to do with coast. Has nothing to do with.
But was he eating fish then?
Because
it's Stirling.
No, I mean Stirling is not so far away from the Forth.
It's not, but it's still
and it's
enough
not,
of a distance. It's not something you necessarily expect fish to be a major part.
Yeah, but I
of the
mean,
diet in that
you find
area.
fish influence in English diet and in
Not on
near
the coast.
coastal regions.
Okay, I think we need to go and look at that. Okay. It's kind of ridiculous, to my mind, in that we're getting an isotope signature that's saying there's a high proportion of marine fish. Stirling isn't on the coast. You know, I might expect freshwater fish because, you know, there are rivers around there and some very pretty ones too. But it's not exactly a coastal community. It's not Aberdeen.
The forensic evidence and the historical research indicate the Stirling cold case was a warrior on horseback, a knight. But Wolfram's isotope data says that he ate a lot of saltwater fish. Xanthi is now following a lead that could just explain the link between these two seemingly unrelated facts. In Southampton, one of Britain's most important ports in the Middle Ages, Xanthi is meeting food historian Professor Chris Woolgar.
Hello, Nick.
Hi, Chris.
And this is Xanthi.
Hi, Xanthi. Nice to meet you.
Hello, lovely to meet
He's treating Xanthi to a tasting menu of authentic medieval fish dishes.
Were they preserving these dishes, these fish, for eating all year round?
Yes, it's very important to them to have food that preserves well. And in fact, much of the staple fish is preserved, and it comes particularly as wind-dried cod or salted cod. We have records of boats coming into Hull in the 1380s, 1390s, with as many as 96,000 preserved fish on board.
It seems that dried or salted fish was a huge industry that fed a fast-growing coastal and inland population.
This is dried cod that we saw earlier.
This is dried cod with a medieval sweet and sour sauce.
That's quite nice, actually, isn't it? I don't expect it not to be nice, but, you know.
But fish wasn't just food for the body. There's another reason why a medieval knight might favour fish over meat.
So 30% fish sounds like an awful lot to me. Is that a kind of common component of a medieval diet?
Interestingly, it often links to their conception of religious virtue. Fish is most like the food that men will eat in paradise.
Oh.
And the reason is that it is a way of avoiding carnality and meat and the corruption that comes from it. It leads people into lust and to gluttony and into sin.
And there's one final clue.
Preserved fish like this was a very good way of provisioning armies.
Yeah.
And when we see the calculations that the English Exchequer made for provisioning its armies going to Scotland, we can see that fish forms, I guess, probably well over a third of the diet that's there.
As much as that?
Yes.
So a high fish diet tells us that our man was eating the standard food of the army, and it was also the diet expected of a pious Christian knight. This fits perfectly into the growing profile of our Stirling warrior. Back in Dundee, Caroline Needham is showing her colleague Caroline Wilkinson how the face of the Stirling knight is developing.
So I've added the pegs.
The pegs indicate the depth of the tissue they are about to position on the face, now that they have reassembled the skull in the computer.
Areas where we've had to rebuild with the different fragments, put them together, there's always a bit more room for error there. But I think because we've had most of the skull, it shouldn't be too far out. I can show you the muscles that I've started to add. Okay. I've got a neck for him if you want to take a look. So this is from a laser scan of somebody, and I've adapted it to fit this skull.
Well, that's quite a beefy neck, but it looks like it's in the correct position from these mastoid processes.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's getting to look more beefy by the minute.
He is.
He's got a big square face at the moment.
Very, especially the lower face and the jaw, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay, so we've got a nose to add to the measurements, and then it's just skin and ears.
Yeah. So if I just get rid of the plane and put the skin back to normal, we can have a good look at what he looks like.
Oh, wow, that's great.
Excellent.
Looks like a rugby player. I think he's got quite a nice face, though. He doesn't look...
At rest, I think he looks perfectly pleasant.
Yeah, and I think because
on a battlefield,
that'd be a different
Well,
story.
that's true.
He's got this interesting gap between his teeth as well, which is quite endearing, I think.
And his ears stick out a bit.
That's true.
The next step is to work on the full body reconstruction to show how beefy he really was. Then the reconstruction will be almost complete. But there is one more critical line of inquiry. What caused our knight's death? His grave provided the biggest clue. An arrowhead was found mixed with his bones. But would a single arrowhead have been lethal enough to kill such a powerfully built man? Xanthi has come to the Royal Armouries in Leeds. She's meeting Graham Reimer, medieval weapons expert. He recognises the type of arrowhead found in our man. It was designed to cause maximum damage to flesh.
This is the nature of arrowhead that will be used in both hunting and warfare. It's a fairly grim process, but archery is done usually through hemorrhage. The arrowhead, the blades, as it were, these long barbs extending backwards from the main head, were sharp all the way down. So as the arrowhead penetrated, it would do a lot of cutting as it went in.
So there's going to be a lot of bleeding associated?
Well, that's how it works. And the barbs are there to prevent the arrowhead coming out.
He wants to show Xanthi a similar, better preserved arrowhead. It becomes clear how this lethal weapon could have brought our man down.
Okay. Ooh.
Well, here's a draw of some of our medieval arrowheads. Yeah, this is the most similar that we have easily available with the long barbs.
Oh, okay.
This is how it would have fitted on.
And that looks quite big to me. Is that quite a large
This is a pretty accurate reconstruction of a typical medieval military arrow.
An X-ray confirms that the arrowhead found with our man had a very similar barbed head.
There are medical treatises in the Middle Ages which explain how you may remove arrowheads of different designs, and the barbed head really can only come out by keeping going with the direction in which it went into the body. So essentially you had to push it right the way through. There was no easy way of extracting it, and simply the process of trying to extract it could cause fatal injury anyway. So it's a very effective weapon in that sense, and a very nasty thing to be shot by. If it wasn't more or less instantly fatal, it would certainly prove so in a relatively short period of time.
The type of arrowhead found with our man was designed to cause maximum damage and to be difficult to remove. Up until the 13th century, the knight on horseback had ruled on the battlefield, but the rise of the archer, cheap but effective, was one of the turning points in the history of warfare. Back in Dundee, Wolfram has some more surprises. The results of his isotope tests on the knight's back tooth reveal where he grew up. Are we about to find out if he was English or Scottish?
Can you take us through what you've found about our gentleman from Stirling Castle?
What we have found so far from the two molars we had in our lab, that during that period, let's say generally 8 years to 15 years of age, that this person has definitely not lived in Scotland.
Ooh. Okay.
Between the ages of 8 and 15, the knight was growing up in either southern England or western France, geographically close but politically very different.
Adding to what you just, the rather big bombshell that you just dropped, if you were to geographically come down the UK, so we're happy it's not in Scotland, how far down that UK can you get?
You would have to go down far south to the home counties.
Okay.
So Sussex, Devon.
So you have to be in the real
You really
south.
have to be. You have to be close to the channel in essence.
And that's a very sort of specific geographical area. When we then say France, do we mean the entirety of France?
No, not.
Or is there a part of France that equates
basically
more?
Let's say it. Unfortunately, the France, as far as our maps and our understanding at the moment goes, we can sort of split into two parts, and you would say this signature is closer to the west coast.
He's not Scottish, but is he a French ally or an English enemy?
I think our natural inclination was that this was going to be a Scottish knight. So a very important turning point in this entire investigation has been Wolfram's stable isotope information. That has really changed the pattern of who we think this person may have been. So we've got to now sort of come away from the Scottish concept that, you know, is embedded in the Scottish knight. We all think of him as being Sean Connery, don't we? But he's not Scottish, not by what we've seen today. And he could be English, but no, we don't want him to be English. We're in Scotland here, we'd quite like him to be French.
Xanthi has come to Edinburgh Castle to meet Dr. Katie Stevenson, a medieval historian. She might be able to shed some light on whether our knight was part of the French troops sent to support the Scottish against the English.
So was there a presence, a French presence, in Stirling in the 14th century?
In Scotland, most definitely. There's obviously quite a lot of diplomacy surrounding the Old Alliance, which is taking place. The Old Alliance, very simply, is an ongoing and renewable treaty between the Scots and the French that and it's basically to do with England. If England invades Scotland, the French will come to the Scots' aid. If England invades France, the Scots will go to the French aid. So it's about providing military support to each other on the borders of
Against
England.
the English?
Yeah.
Nice.
There is also evidence that there were French forces in Scotland in the 14th century.
In 1385, a large French force arrived at the port of Leith outside Edinburgh to support the Scots. The army mustered here at the castle. Could our man have been part of this expedition?
Here we have an example of muster rolls for the 1385 campaign, where we get a sense of the type of men who were coming. So there's lists here of squires, and there's some 3,000 names here of the men who came over.
Not only is every soldier listed, but the route they took is well documented.
So here they are coming into Leith, which is the port of Leith in Edinburgh, basically. As you can see, they head south into the Anglo-Scottish borders. It's quite far from Stirling. They're not heading north into sort of central Scotland. They're coming into the borders area. It's pretty clear they don't go to Stirling.
The Old Alliance meant a French military presence in Scotland in the 14th century, but there's no evidence for a French fighting man's burial at Stirling. It's a dead end. It leaves one remaining possibility for Xanthi's research. Our knight was English. Meanwhile, the two Carolines are making good progress. Based on the bone scans, Caroline Needham is starting to reconstruct the knight's body.
I've got the measurements that we took of the bones. So from those, I've made a life-size model on here. So Okay. I'll just open him for you. And then if you'd like to see the skin, I'll just turn that on. I'll make it see-through to begin with.
So this is doing nothing to suggest that he isn't a rugby player, is it?
Not really, no.
So let's just see the finished skin, because he's looking very big upper body, very short and squat legs.
Absolutely.
It's great.
That's the finished man.
Yeah. Yeah, he looks great. Looks fantastic. I really like him. Yeah, we've certainly got the body for fighting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Aw, I like him.
Yeah.
Xanthi has come to the National Archives to find out whether there's any surviving records of the English at Stirling Castle in the 14th century. The Holy Grail is to find a name for the knight, but it seems unlikely given he died over 600 years ago. She's meeting archivist Jessica Lutkin, who has uncovered some surprising documents.
Okay, so what have you got?
Okay, we have some petitions.
Petitions?
Petitions.
Okay.
That date around the time of the wars in Scotland, so Bannockburn, etc. So this is a direct petition to the King and his Council and Parliament.
A request?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
I can't read that.
This is Anglo-Norman French, so it's it's
Okay.
Franglais. It's quite easy to understand.
Okay.
The request refers to an Englishman, William de Mouchon, who was captured at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 and held for ransom. Hostage-taking, a common tool in medieval power play, often involved keeping VIPs under house arrest until deals were struck.
So I was hoping that this would be somebody who was
could
killed.
be our man.
Yes,
Ooh,
it could be our
okay.
man. The unfortunate thing is his son and heir was swapped as a hostage for his father.
Okay.
And so William did not die at Stirling Castle.
Right.
So the first document is a red herring. William de Mouchon didn't die a hostage at Stirling Castle. So if our knight was English, maybe he died during one of the many English occupations of the castle. Jessica has unearthed another, even more extraordinary document.
This is the last of our potentials.
Exciting.
Okay. So this is an account of Stirling Castle.
Oh.
When it was held by the English. And so everything was accounted for.
Right.
So all the expenses of the castle and who was at the castle.
We have names of everyone at the castle.
We have names of everybody at the castle.
You look excited now. This is
I am
great.
excited. I did
Okay.
not expect to find this kind of document with all these details on it. This is a real treat.
Nice.
And this account is dated 1340, 1341.
Right, okay.
Okay, and so you have all the list of the names. So you have knights at the top, and these are all men-at-arms.
Right, so these are all the people at the castle?
Yes, and what I want to show you is this name here.
Oh.
Sir John de Strictly.
Oh, okay.
Does that word ring a bell?
I can't read that word.
That says obit.
Oh, he's dead.
He's dead. And he
Oh.
died at Stirling Castle on the 10th of October. And the year is 1341.
Oh, that is fantastic.
It's an extraordinary discovery, which supports the carbon-14 dating of our man's bones. The following year, 1342, the Scottish reclaimed the castle, so could this English knight who died there be our man?
You can see at the end of his name, Miles, which is knight, so he was a senior member of the
right, so
garrison.
he's a really important person.
Yes,
So
yeah.
he could have been important enough to be buried within the castle itself.
Quite possibly, yes.
And at this time, would the castle have been under siege, the Scottish, if the English were holding it?
It wasn't under siege at this point. The siege of Stirling, when the Scots won the castle back, started in 1342. However, there still would have been a few skirmishes.
Yeah.
It was a very unsettled time, which is
Yeah.
why you had such an extensive garrison there.
So this could really be our guy.
That is a
couldn't it?
potential name, yes.
Is that our boy?
So yes, so we have John de Strictley, who died at the castle. We don't know how he died.
Yeah.
We don't know what age he was when he died. And of course, it doesn't confirm that he was buried at the castle.
No.
But I think this is one of the best possible examples of the kind of scenario you're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. I just never expected it. I never expected to find a potential name. I can't believe it, actually.
I have to admit, it was a big surprise to me as well.
I mean, for me, this is the ultimate, isn't it? Finding a name is the kind of ultimate aim of what we're doing. But I didn't expect it.
No, neither did I.
And if you're surprised, it shows just how exciting that really is.
Yes, it is quite extraordinary.
So John de Strictley, that may be our boy.
Honestly, I think what I just learned is absolutely thrilling. It's so exciting that we've found a potential name and it could genuinely be our knight. And I just never expected that in a million years, that we'd actually get a name from, you know, the 1300s. It's just amazing. Fantastic. I think the team are going to be thrilled when I tell them.
Jessica's further research on the de Strictley family seems to suggest that the family line has died out. Sadly, the woman who was buried with Sir John will probably never be known. In the 14th century, women weren't usually deemed important enough to be documented. It's the final team meeting. Using forensic investigation and historical research, the team has established that our Stirling man was a powerful, battle-scarred knight. And despite the fact that he was buried in a Scottish castle, he was probably English and may have died from an arrow wound whilst fighting the Scots. Now, over 650 years after his death, the team is about to give him back his face and a possible name.
So I have to bring over this list. Oh yes, I've got some rather interesting news. I have.
Good, let's hear it. Good.
Right, okay. We don't have any evidence to say there were any French burials at Stirling. So, we have to return to the question of whether he was in fact English. Now, there's one particular scenario and one particular individual in that scenario which fits everything. So, during the 1330s to 1340s, it's documented the English actually held Stirling Castle for 10 years. But we have actually got a list of all of the people who were there as fighting men. And it's quite exciting because this actually indicates that the person third down died during this time at the castle. His name is Sir John de Strictley.
It's really quite an incredible result.
It's big.
Because all we had was
It's a great
all we
result.
had was a bit of a scar, and we had a bit of well-developed, a bit of beefcake, quite frankly, was what we had.
So now we know circumstances and why he's there.
Everything fit. And it's the capability of having those historical documents that suddenly give you a window that the science doesn't give you, which is getting to the name. And I think the history's really shored this
But
up.
virtually without the science, you wouldn't even have a starting point there to look.
Yes, it's the alliance. Yeah. It's the alliance between the two. And that's fantastic to have, from so far back in time, a document that gives you a name.
Yeah.
That's great.
So, do we want to see what he looks like?
Yes, we do.
Obviously, we don't know details of skin colour and eye colour and hair colour. We've estimated as a best guess based on the period of time and where we think he came from.
Go on, let's have a look.
Here we go. There we go.
Okay. Oh, he looks like a footballer.
Well, rugby player.
Rugby player. I actually see he's got more like a rugby player.
Nice scar. Sir John de Strictley. Yeah. John. This is John.
Sir John.
Sir John.
Very nice. That looks very good.
Yeah.
The next thing we've got is that we've taken this, and with the information that we have from the skeleton, Caroline has produced a full body.
Look at the muscle there.
Oh.
Nice.
Fantastic. That is really very special. Very beautifully done. Beautifully done. That's
Nice
really
job,
good.
Caroline.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well done.
For Sue, the story of the Stirling cold case was always in his bones. His muscles carved out their own signature. They told the team he wasn't just a soldier, he was an English knight. And now, for the first time since his death over 600 years ago, the team have given him back his identity.
When you start with something that in some respects was less than optimal, and we really didn't know where we were going to go with this. He's a very interesting skeleton, but the chances of any historical case to at least get it back to a possible name is not something we ever anticipated we would be able to do. So this has gone much further than we could ever have predicted. Absolutely unexpected. And probably as far as we can go on this, the case is closed.
With the knight's forensic journey now over, he has returned to Historic Scotland's store in Edinburgh. He left an enigma. He's coming back with a possible name. Britain's finest unit for forensic investigation has a brand new mission. Now, for the first time, they'll turn their skills to investigate bodies from the long, distant past. They'll open new windows on history as they strive to put a face on some extraordinary human remains. Britain's finest unit for forensic investigation is embarking on a new and groundbreaking mission. Experts in human identification, they use the full arsenal of modern technology. But now, for the first time, they're applying these skills to identify bodies from the long, distant past.
It's very exciting for us to be able to take the skills that we use on a daily basis and apply them to look at historical skeletons to see just how far we can go.
Forensic anthropology, facial reconstruction, and painstaking research will be used to open new windows on history as dramatic personal stories emerge from long forgotten bones.
Historical research is allowing me to investigate people's experiences at different times throughout history.
He certainly had a nasty crack to the top of his head that could well have contributed to his death.
So we've got the face, the facial reconstruction, and we've added some textures.
Fantastic. That is just superb.
The latest case surrounds the heavily scarred skeleton of a woman that has puzzled historians since it was excavated by the Museum of London in 1992.
It's just horrendous. That must have been so painful.
The bones reveal shocking new truths about life on the streets of Victorian London.
That's just an open wound.
That's right.
And the case takes a dark and dramatic turn.
Men, I'm afraid, will find children sexually attractive.
Can they piece together the woman's identity and discover why she was left in an unmarked grave?
This one doesn't add up.
Oh, this is a mystery, isn't it?
The cold case team is heading back to one of the darkest chapters of the 19th century. This is the Centre for Anatomy and Human Identification at Dundee University. Professor Sue Black will carry out the initial observation on this mysterious skeleton with her colleague, Dr. Xanthi Mallet.
We have KCW 1211, excavation site of specimen burial ground located in Borough, central London.
Why no Borough?
Do you?
Yes, I know Borough. I used to cycle round Elephant Castle roundabout.
Okay.
In another life.
At this stage, they have very little information.
Oh, it's very heavy.
But as they lay out the bones, it's clear this skeleton has a story to tell.
Oh, there's lots of interesting things going on in there. Good.
The gender and age quickly become apparent.
Everything about it shouts female.
Grasshopper as well.
So in terms of supraorbital ridges, mastoids, nuchal lines, you can see just the edge of the epiphysis there. It's not finished growing. So that puts her down into the 20s category quite comfortably.
By measuring the long bones of the leg, they can estimate this young woman's height.
That equals
4'7".
Yeah.
Tiny. Absolutely tiny.
But the most dramatic aspect of her skeleton are the scars visible on almost every bone of her body.
We've got significant evidence of an infective situation,
right,
which is throughout the body, very prominent within the skull. We've even got it on the back of the manubrium. That's it. So it's just following absolute textbook syphilis, the whole thing. Let's look at the thickness of
Syphilis was once one of the most feared bacterial diseases in the world. Arriving in Europe around 1490, it once affected up to 15% of the British population.
It's just so heavy because there's been so much bone alteration and deposition. That must have been so painful. Okay, female, young adult, very, very, very short. Very, very, very short, with syphilis. She's just a little, small, young adult. And at the same time, what you've got is superimposed upon this, the horror that would have been syphilis. The fact that not only is her bone being eaten away and the pain associated with that, but the disfigurement that comes with it as well. And the disfigurement that comes with it is a cruel disfigurement because preferentially it wants to go to your face. It's not the kind of face that children would happily look at. It's the kind of face that children would cry at. And that's quite sad for someone who's so very young.
So this is the body of a young woman, probably in her 20s. She was around 4'7" tall and was ravaged by syphilis. To reconstruct the details of her life, the team will need to delve into a murky world of quacks and agonizing treatments for a disease that remained a medical mystery.
Case reference CW.
Sue and Xanthi bring together the rest of the team at the evidence board. Dr. Caroline Wilkinson will carry out the facial reconstruction, while Dr. Wolfram Meyer-Orgenstein will analyse trace minerals in the bones. These will reveal information about her diet, her social status, and where she might have lived and died.
There's an area of, quite an extensive area of alteration on the frontal bone. The other area where the changes are most extensive are down at the lower end of the lower limbs. And this is a fairly typical pattern for syphilis, which is quite far advanced. It's not the stage of syphilitic change where the face is eaten away in terms of bone.
There may be a little going on the nasal bones.
On the nose. What those photographs also show is extensive bowing on the legs as well. I think that's probably as a result of rickets. I think we've got a dietary deficiency in there as well.
And then you would say basically somebody from a whatever lower social status.
I think that's probably true. Presumably the archaeologists will be happy about the dating and the location. You need to go and find out. You need to go and find out any artefacts associated with her, anybody else in that vicinity. Is she on consecrated ground or not? All of those sorts of things.
Yep.
In terms of hard evidence, all they have is a set of bones, but they're a doorway into the story. And for Sue Black, that's the beauty of the challenge.
She was dealt a fairly mean set of cards. It wasn't a good hand she was given. If you just looked at it as being a skeleton, and nothing more than a skeleton, then you're just not seeing below the surface. And everybody, every single person has got a story. And it's our job to try and find the story. And the more we can personalise that person, the more we can feel we get to know them.
Xanthi's job is to go in search of historical clues about who the woman was and what kind of life she had. The trail will start in London, at the site where her body was discovered. Facial reconstruction expert Caroline Wilkinson often has to deal with badly damaged skulls when trying to rebuild a person's face.
Caroline and I have known each other for a number of years, and I actively sought to take Caroline to Dundee because she has a skill set that I am not aware that anybody else possesses. She is the best at what she does. So that anything that comes into here that involves faces, it's Caroline, because that's her area, and nobody will beat her in that.
But the diseased head of our woman will pose a unique challenge. Before Caroline starts work on the reconstruction, she examines the skull with her colleague Caroline Needham.
Now, what have we got there?
We need to know about these nasal bones because there's quite a bit missing. And that would obviously have an effect on what her nose is going to look like. Well, this is an interesting skull because it's clearly got some pathological condition that we need to take into account with the reconstruction. Things like syphilis can affect the shape and form of the soft tissues of the face. So we need to assess the severity of it, how long-standing it will have been, how long the person had it for, so that we can make a best estimate of how that would have affected the features of their face. I always enjoy reconstructions where we've got more of a challenge. And it's nice to be able to show conditions, especially conditions that we might not necessarily see in contemporary population in an archaeological investigation.
With the visual examination complete, laser technology creates a detailed 3D representation of the skull. The laser scan will be used as a base on top of which the complex layers of muscle and tissue can be added. But it will be a few weeks before the unique face of our woman starts to emerge.
We all have the same muscles on our face, but because each skull is a slightly different shape, one skull may be thinner and longer than the other, another may be fatter, and so once you model each of those muscles in place, then you will automatically get a different face shape with different proportions because it's the skull that dictates the muscle structure.
Xanthi arrives in London to learn more about where the skeleton was found and start building a picture of her life.
What this historical research is allowing me to do is to really investigate people's experiences at different times throughout history, because normally I actively don't look into the person's history because your report has to be objective, scientific. There can be no personal influence. I start with the science and it ends with the science because it has to, because it's part of a forensic process.
Tucked away in a back street of Borough near London Bridge is a burial site known as Crossbones. This was the last resting place of the young woman. Xanthi is here to meet Adrian Miles from the Museum of London, who excavated the body in 1992.
The site was actually underneath this big brick building here, which is an electricity substation that was built as part of the Jubilee Line extension.
So you wanted to excavate the site before that building was actually placed?
Yes.
Okay.
I think we had 6 weeks to do it in total.
6 weeks? What happened to this site after you excavated it? Did you remove all of the remains?
All the remains from underneath the building were removed. The unexcavated areas still have the burial ground.
So this all has...
We are now standing on untouched burial ground, yes. There are several thousand burials beneath our feet.
Us.
There's a theory that it was a single women's burial ground, prostitutes, basically. By the period that we're excavating at, it's very much the poor ground for the parish of St Saviour's, in that the people who would be buried here would be the poor of the parish, bodies found in the river, people from the workhouse.
So people who couldn't afford
People who couldn't afford to pay for their own burials.
The history of the site immediately suggests this woman came from a very poor background.
All the burials were in coffins, but they're of the poorest standard that I've ever seen.
Really?
You're looking at reused wood. It's probably cheap wood that's coming off the docks. I mean, there's a couple of photos here from the excavation as we were...
Very tightly packed, obviously, aren't they?
Yes, very much so. Not only are they tightly packed horizontally, they're also up to 9 or 10 deep.
Really? So this whole ground basically would have been 8 or 9, 10 deep in coffins. That's basically what you're walking on with some soil over the top.
Yes, and not a lot of soil.
Really? And how far down was the young woman we've been talking about?
Within a metre of the top of the excavation.
So she was a fairly
So
late...
she would have been one of the latest burials that we dug, yeah.
Is there anything that could help us really pin down a date or at least a time specifically when she might have actually been interred?
The burial ground closes in October 1853.
So we know it was obviously previous.
So it must be pre that.
Yeah.
Given the intensive use of the burial ground and the amount of burials that were going in, you wouldn't have survived in place long.
Yeah.
Maybe as little as 10 or 20 years.
So really from post-1830s, really.
Yes.
1830s to 1853.
Yeah.
The Crossbones woman was clearly not among those benefiting from the burgeoning wealth of the Victorian Empire. At that time, the borough area of London was a slum, filthy and overcrowded. Having learned that the woman was most likely buried around the mid-19th century, this gives the team a window in which to research historical records. The Victorians are known for keeping detailed population registers, but could the young woman be among the names? Xanthi has come to the London Metropolitan Archive to meet Dr. David Green from King's College London.
We found this young woman. She's in an unmarked grave. I was really hoping you could find a potential name for her. Is that something you think you could do?
It's possible.
Year of death is going to be difficult because it's unmarked, but I've got a time period when I think she may have been buried within.
Yeah, we could look at burial registers.
Yeah.
Each parish kept a burial register.
All right.
We could look at hospital records. There's a couple of hospitals in the locality. There's also a workhouse in the locality, and if she was poor...
Yes, she was, yeah.
Well, she may well have died in the workhouse.
She was very poor, and interestingly, we know that she was suffering from syphilis. I don't know as yet whether she's been treated for that, but certainly she had medical conditions, so that might be a good place as well.
Well, those would be the 3 places I'd start. Once we've got a set of names, we might even get an age. Let's see what we can find.
Give it a go.
We'll give it a go.
Over the next few weeks, David will look through hundreds of records from the borough area. He will cross-reference the results of the team's forensic investigation with hospital and burial records. It's a long shot, but can he put a name to the skeleton? The context of where and how the skeleton was found points to the woman having come from a very poor background. Now it's up to science to confirm whether her bones back up the historical evidence. In Dundee, Wolfram is carrying out further analysis of the bones.
How is it looking?
He knows what he's talking about. He, to my mind, is the grandfather of all stable isotope analysis. There is nobody else that I would go to. There is nobody else that I would trust in terms of relaying that information for a forensic investigation.
By studying the carbon and nitrogen isotopes within the bones, he can discover details about the person's diet and geographical movements during their lifetime. But in this case, the fact that she was riddled with syphilis has broken down the composition of the bone and is affecting the results.
Just by looking at the bone, you can see the attack that has taken place. A bone, no matter which bone you're looking at in the skeleton, has a pitted appearance. So the chances are that we will not get any meaningful data which would give us an indication about geographical provenance.
Although he won't be able to reveal the woman's geographical movements, Wolfram has been able to uncover vital information about her diet.
The carbon signature was suggesting a diet that's sort of at the lower end, so omnivore, not that much meat in the diet, more vegetables and whatnot.
This means our woman ate very little protein, confirming that hers was not a life of privilege. Xanthes arrived at the Museum of London, one of the world's largest collections of skeletons, holding an extraordinary 17,000 bodies in its vaults. The Crossbones woman was one of 148 skeletons found at the same burial site. A high proportion of them were infants, reflecting the high mortality rate in poor areas of Britain at the time. Xanthe is meeting curator Jelena Bekvalak to see if the bones of the children can shed new light on the early life of the Crossbones woman.
That area particularly wasn't a very nice area at all. I mean, it really was known for being quite a sort of a slum area, bad cases of things like cholera, infection. So not a very good environment at all for being born into and then trying to survive and living. So you were doing very well actually to sort of live and survive in that sort of condition.
So is there anything within the actual skeletons that can indicate that they had poor diet, so, you know, a relationship to their lifestyle?
Yeah, there are. Something like rickets is something that we might see in the skeletons. This is a femur, so that's your leg bone, and this is on the right-hand side.
How old is this individual?
This individual's probably aged about 1.5 years old. What we were seeing in these children is that we saw a much higher rate of rickets, active rickets, and also things like scurvy as well, which would indicate to us the sort of environment and nutrition that they were getting.
So they're not eating fresh fruit and vegetables,
no,
essentially?
They haven't got a very good diet, no. Yeah. You've got pollutants, industrialisation and poor diet. So we're seeing that in the skeletons.
19th century Borough would have been covered in thick smog caused by industrial pollution. And the bending of the bones that characterised rickets was caused by lack of exposure to sunlight as well as a poor diet. Xanthe is starting to build up a compelling profile of our young woman. Her circumstances weren't unique, but if we can reclaim her as an individual, what can we learn about the time she lived in, seen through her eyes?
What's really come out from talking to Jelena is that the people buried in this gravesite and the people living in that area of London at that time really were the poorest of the poor. They were suffering from disease, poor diet. She was only in her early 20s when she died. So really, I mean, she's had quite a sad, desperate existence.
Back in Dundee, Caroline is starting the facial reconstruction.
The first thing that we do is to build up the muscles of the face one by one onto the skull. So we have a database of pre-modelled muscles. We import each one and then alter it to fit the new shape of the skull. Each muscle will give the shape of the face at that point. So the skull dictates the muscle structure and the muscle structure dictates the overall facial appearance. And then we can look at the details of the face, such as some of the features like the nose and the mouth and the eyes and the ears, and position those from looking at the morphology, which is the shape of the bone.
The next stage will be to uncover precisely how the syphilis would have disfigured the woman's face. With the different areas of the investigation having made good progress, the team reassembles at the evidence board.
We think that our young woman died towards the end of use of this particular graveyard because of where she was located. She's quite close to the top, but she was left in situ. The grave wasn't marked, so we don't know who she is exactly when she was buried, but there may be records that may help us indicate who she might have been.
The team now turn their attention to finding out how this young woman caught her disfiguring disease.
We're not talking about congenital syphilis here, are we?
No.
We're talking about sexually transmitted syphilis. Because if this was congenital syphilis, that means, you know, it was passed to her from her mother.
Yep.
Then the effect as the bones and the teeth are growing, they are deformed.
Congenital syphilis shows specific symptoms, the most obvious of which are notches in the teeth. The Crossbones woman's, however, tell the story of syphilis caught through sexual contact.
The syphilis comes at a later age. The bones and the teeth are already formed. You're looking at an after effect, if you like. And so with the lesions that you have in the forehead, it's a taking away of bone and a laying down of new bone. It's not a malformed bone, if you like, in terms of its development. And so this has to be sexually transmitted.
I agree with that, yeah.
I think the next thing that we have to do is go back to the clinicians.
Yeah.
So I think you've got to go and speak to them about how long will she have been infected by this to get to this level of a presentation. All of treating her almost like a patient.
Yeah.
But I do think we can quite happily ignore this as congenital syphilis. This has to be sexually transmitted.
Yeah.
Everything points to the fact that we're looking at somebody who's low socioeconomic status. She has a sexually transmitted disease. So it's not painting a wonderful Victorian Christmas card scenario for her. It's the much more gritty, realistic side of where do I find the next meal that will keep me alive.
By the 19th century, syphilis was a plague in London, affecting up to 20% of the population. Known as the Great Scourge, it was the AIDS of the Victorian era. The disfiguring effects of the disease are well documented. Joseph Town was a medical artist at Guy's Hospital in the 19th century. He created hundreds of wax anatomical models of patients showing a range of diseases, including syphilis. Xanthi is meeting Dr. Patrick French, who still treats syphilis in the 21st century.
The remarkable thing about syphilis is that it's a condition which has these very distinct stages. I mean, the first stage, 2 or 3 weeks after having sex with someone who's got syphilis, you develop an ulcer. But this is what it looks like. This is an old kind of a 19th century kind of wax model of a syphilis ulcer of the lip. You know, if you ignore it, it will just get better on its own. And it looks as though it's healed up.
Okay.
But it hasn't.
All right, so they would think that they're healing.
That's right, and you know, if you ignore it, it will go away, it will get better. And then a couple of months later, you feel quite sick, you get fever, and the characteristic thing that happens in secondary syphilis is that you develop a rash.
Yeah.
This is a pretty extreme model of a secondary syphilis rash affecting the face, these kind of pustules. Again, it gets better if you leave it untreated. So after about a month or two, it would have got better.
Right,
and of course, she'd be living at a time when there are all sorts of illnesses going around.
Absolutely.
And if you had something that didn't get worse and you got better from, you would then just ignore that.
Yeah, of course.
And then a large minority of people, maybe about 40% of people, develop tertiary syphilis. And there are 3 sorts of tertiary syphilis. There's syphilis affecting the heart, syphilis affecting the brain, which sometimes can take decades to occur. But also, and clearly what she had, was something called gummatous syphilis, where you get these pretty nasty lumps of dead tissue, of scar tissue, which affect bones and particularly affect skin. And this is someone with a gumma, one of these horrible areas of dying tissue affecting the nose.
So this is necrosing tissue right in the centre of her face.
Exactly. The general view is that it's probably reinfection with syphilis that causes gammata.
So
no one really knows for certain, but that's the likely cause.
And in the minds of moralising Victorians, repeated infection of syphilis could mean only one thing.
STDs, including syphilis, were strongly associated with prostitution at that time.
Thinking about what Patrick said about the fact that it's sexually transmitted and how this was associated largely, rightly or wrongly, with prostitution. So, I mean, I think that's quite a dark line to travel down, but I think certainly there's some indications that this young woman could have caught it as a result of being a prostitute.
Now the team has more information about how the disease would have affected the woman's face, Caroline can start adding the scarring to facial reconstruction.
I'm now trying to add the disease process, the syphilis, so that we can see the lesions. And I can make the skin layer transparent so that I can see the bone beneath, and I can use the lesions on the bone to tell me where the lesions on the soft tissue will be. So I've just been positioning lumps of clay over the surface of the skin, coming through the skin, that are related to the lesions on the bone. And then we can go in and, once we've got the position correct, we can alter the details so that we can see more of these type of lesions and more of the destruction of the soft tissues.
Slowly, she's coming back to life. The pomp and prosperity of the Victorian era masked a dark side of poverty and prostitution. Unless you were born or married into wealth, 19th century London could be a harsh place for a woman. Sadly, with few employment options and barely any state support, it was all too easy for a single woman to fall on hard times. Many found themselves trying to gain entry to the refuge of the destitute. Founded in 1806, it was a charitable alternative to prison for petty criminals who the authorities thought could still be reformed. Xanthi has come to the Hackney Archives in London. She's here to look at the details of people who applied for entry into the refuge of the destitute. The entries reveal just how many young women turned to prostitution.
It's number 68, narrative of Mary Harris, 18 years of age, of Bath. Her father and mother died when she was very young. About 3 months since, she was enticed from the service of a Mr. Levy, Westcott Street, Bath, by a gentleman's footman and brought to London. He forsook her a week after the trial in town, and as she has been a prostitute in the house to which he brought her till about a week ago. I read the petition of Sarah Wade, 18 years of age, of St Saviour's Parish, Borough. Before she became a prostitute, she lived a servant with a Mrs. Beaumont, a foreign lady, upon whose leaving England the petitioner was left destitute, when she was seduced by some young women who persuaded her that she might earn more money by prostitution. On account of disagreement, she left her father and has since been a prostitute. All of these women, even though they're only young, they're only 17, 18 years of age, are really at the stage of desperation where they need somebody to help them. I mean, this is, their last hope.
But if that last hope of refuge failed them, then prostitution was often the only option. It's very plausible the Crossbones woman too survived by these means. Xanthi has discovered that the burial ground where her body was found had a long association with the profession. In the medieval period, the area around the burial ground was owned by the Bishop of Winchester. He licensed prostitutes who became known as Winchester geese. When they died, they were buried at Crossbones. To this day, people tie names of so-called single women known to have been buried in the area to the gates. It has become a shrine to their memory. By the 19th century, prostitution was a major industry in Victorian Britain, bringing in over £20 million a year. London was known as the whore shop of the world. It's been estimated that a fifth of the female population of London were involved in the profession. Although disapproved of by some, prostitution was not illegal. Xanthi is meeting historian Hallie Rubenhold to find out what life was like for the Victorian prostitute.
Women's work is so poorly paid, you can never support yourself and maybe your 6 children. And so you find yourself in a situation where you quite literally have to exchange sexual favours for food in many cases. And that's what a lot of these women were forced into. Prostitution was rife, and especially in the slums. And Borough actually was one of the worst slums in all of London.
What dangers would have been involved for her? She was doing this on a daily basis.
Well, obviously there were tremendous dangers involved in a life of prostitution. Disease being the foremost among them. people didn't use prophylactics in the same way that we would use them today, and those that they did use, the condoms, tended to be reusable and weren't always the cleanest things. You would wash it and reuse it, and they weren't always the most effective things either.
So taking what we know about the woman where she was buried, a particular female we've been looking at, we know from the skeleton that she had syphilis. Was that a common problem for prostitutes?
It most certainly was, and actually the lowest prostitutes were generally those who had contracted syphilis and they were on the way out.
So she would have been in that very possibly lowest class of prostitute.
Yes, it's where prostitute meets beggar, basically. So really destitute, and these are the people who generally were found dead the next morning in the alleyways, having frozen or starved or died of whatever illness they were suffering from.
Sadly, the evidence for our young woman having been one of these lower-class prostitutes is growing. She was ravaged with syphilis, presumably through repeated sexual contact, and her body was discovered in a burial ground with a long association with prostitutes. But what can the woman herself tell the team? Sue is putting the skeleton through a very 21st century examination to see inside the bones. This CT scanner can create a three-dimensional X-ray image of the skeleton. This allows Sue to look for signs of trauma or illness not visible to the naked eye. And the data has revealed some information that will take the investigation in a new and horrifying direction.
We'd felt that by looking at everything that we could find on the skeleton, she was probably into her 20s. The X-rays tell us something very, very different. If you can see, there's a very well-defined line passes across there, and there's another one that passes across there. And that tells us that that growth, that fusion that's happened there, wasn't that long ago. So I think in terms of putting her into her 20s, I'm afraid we were making her a little bit older than she probably was. I think it's more likely that she was a late teenager, so that she may have been 17, 18, perhaps even 19 years of age. So in some ways it's really even sadder that what we're looking at is a teenager racked with the amount of disease that we could see apparent on her skeleton. And she's actually a whole lot younger than we thought.
It means that if she was suffering from advanced tertiary syphilis, which often takes years to develop, that she was probably infected as a child. Sue calls the team back to the evidence board to discuss the disturbing discovery that this isn't the body of a woman in her 20s.
We didn't expect to see anything terribly interesting in the CT scans. We thought we might pick up some Harris lines and other things. But what we did pick up is something that's likely to change what we thought was the original age for the young lady. So I think we need to bring her down into a teenager. Ooh. Is the truth. So if you think that we're looking at a teenager, maybe even 15 or 16 years of age, and you're saying that the level of disturbance that we're seeing physically in relation to her could be anything that's 3 to 10 years in the making, then you take 3 years off that, you're in 13.
Don't take 10 off.
10 years off that.
No, don't do
Why not
that.
take 10 years off it? Have you any idea on a daily basis how many cases we work on paedophiles? So that, you know, men, I'm afraid, will find children and teenagers sexually attractive. What's really tragic is you're talking about a first infection that was certainly at a very young, just even possibly even pre-teen, but early teens.
With the age of consent at 13 years old, girls were sexualised at a young age in Victorian Britain. It was also wrongly believed that sleeping with a virgin could cure a man of syphilis. In the absence of medical knowledge about syphilis, quackery and superstition often took hold.
So for the Victorians, the syphilis that seemed to go away and then came back and seemed to go away and came back must have been a really difficult thing to try to manage. When you have this lack of knowledge and lack of understanding of why something occurs, how it progresses, how to stop it, you are in many ways open to the quacks. There will be an entire raft of treatments that will have no effect whatsoever, and there will be those that just become myth. For people who can't even afford those remedies, what else could I try that might try to save me? It's a desperation element. But if you're desperate, you'll try almost anything.
Xanthias returned to London to discover how the Victorians tried to cope with a disease that was so little understood. At the Science Museum, she's meeting Julie Peakman, who has researched Victorian treatments for syphilis.
So what we've got here are some of the treatment bottles.
That looks like a lotion or a cream which might have been applied to the skin.
Right.
And there are also treatments which can be ingested.
So this is a mercury-based treatment. Now, I'm looking at this vial here and it says mercurial cream, poison. So this is obviously a very poisonous treatment.
It was a poison, but mercury was thought to be the best cure for syphilis.
Mercury was believed to help expel syphilis from the body, but the hideous side effects were well known, as illustrated in this Victorian cartoon.
On the left-hand side here, we have a man who's purging and being sick into the bowl, and that was one of the symptoms of mercury because it was a poison.
Yeah.
Spitting and salivation was very important. One of the effects was balding. As you can see, this man in the chair here having his head attended to by one of the hospital interns.
Would you lose your hair in patches or would you lose it all over?
It'd drop off rather like with chemotherapy now. As the toxin starts to work, it would start to fall out.
So, because I think you'd lose patches through the syphilitic change, wouldn't you? Because you've got the pustules on your head, but then the mercury would cause you
just
to
about
lose
finish you off, yes.
all your hair. All right, okay.
And as you can see to the right here, this man's having his teeth seen to, and that was another problem, that the teeth fell out.
Not only did the mercury do nasty things to you, it was also expensive. So if you were poor and suffering from syphilis in Victorian London, you had little choice but to throw yourself on the mercy of charitable hospitals, some of which had wards for the condition. Only one, the Lock Hospital, was dedicated to treating venereal disease, but getting in was no easy matter.
She would have had to plead her case to access that hospital.
She would. You had to go through the governors to be accepted, and they would have had to vet her and see her as a person that they would have wanted to support.
But even if our woman had managed to gain access to mercury treatment, would it have had any positive effect? Xanthi is meeting chemical engineer Hal Sosabowski to recreate a Victorian mercury treatment.
We're going to start making an ointment now, an old-fashioned anti-syphilitic ointment, using a recipe from this pharmacopoeia, British pharmacopoeia. This is the 1869 version. This is unguentum hydrargyrum subchloride. That's the ointment of liquid silver, the subchloride thereof.
There's only got 2 ingredients.
It has. It's got the active ingredient, which is the mercury chloride, and the lard, which is the dispersant.
Yeah.
This is mercury 2 chloride. This used to be called corrosive sublimate. And the reason this is so toxic is it's got mercury ions in it rather than elemental mercury. And mercury ions are A, very soluble in water, and B, are just the right form to do damage to cells by damaging the enzymes. And you just need to make sure we don't breathe any of this in, because this really is hideously toxic. Not healthy at all. So as you can see, there's the 2 parts of the ointment. So this would be sort of what you'd be given by the apothecary, the chemist of the day, the pharmacist, and that would be spread on the pustules
So if I rub this onto my skin regularly as a treatment, what would the effects be?
Well, you couldn't have designed a better way of getting mercury into the body in its worst possible form. And what would happen is the patient would be absorbing mercury into the bloodstream effectively, and therefore they would get the bleeding gums, the irritability, the amnesia, perhaps the depression, all associated with mercury poisoning.
So this is a really bad idea?
Incredibly bad.
OK. If we were in Victorian England now, this would be one of the treatment for syphilis then. But did mercury have any medicinal value at all?
Well, there was some evidence in stage 3 syphilis. It was spiricidal, i.e. it would kill the bacterium that causes syphilis. By that point, you'd certainly reached the point of no return.
Right.
And because there was no penicillin at that time, once you got it, you got it. So all it did was slow down. There's no cure for syphilis. Right, so there we are.
Nice.
Although mercury couldn't cure advanced syphilis, it could have given the sufferer like our woman some relief.
It may seem ridiculous that people would have inhaled mercury or rubbed it on their lesions or taken it as a pill, but it could be argued that we use treatments that are equally as damaging now. If you think of chemotherapy, we know it has beneficial effects, obviously, but the harmful effects are clear to see.
But this has highlighted another unknown aspect to this case. Xanthi still doesn't know whether or not our woman ever received any medical treatment for a disease that she clearly lived with for some time. Archaeologist Fiona Tucker might have the answer. Fiona has been analysing skeletons from the Victorian era for traces of the mercury treatment. One of the skeletons in her study is the crossbones woman, and the amount of mercury in our woman's bones is significant.
In your opinion, did she show signs of having mercury treatment and poisoning in her skeleton?
On the ICP-MS test, which measures the elemental makeup of her bones, we found 7.33 parts per million of mercury, which is substantially higher than both modern levels, where you expect about 0.05 parts per million, because we don't come into contact with mercury much in everyday life anymore, and other individuals from her period who I looked at who had 1 to 1.5 parts per million, which I think in an age where mercury was much more prevalent would be a reasonable amount to find. Her raised level suggests she came into contact with a lot more mercury during her life.
Is there anything here that indicates that she was having mercury treatment from the actual bones?
The thing it seems to have affected most often is the teeth. That's something we have from historical sources, that mercury weakens teeth and can make them fall out. And she does have particularly poor teeth for her age in terms of tooth loss and dental care. I think this girl had it a long time and it was very serious, but she was living with it. The pattern of healing suggests that she was living with it for a long time, and I think it's unlikely that it killed her.
Despite her poor background and advanced stage of syphilis, it appears our woman did manage to access mercury treatment. Her bones also show signs of healing.
I've got a slightly more optimistic impression of the kind of society in which our young woman would have been living in. I mean, she had syphilis, it is a debilitating disease, but she had managed to access some treatment. Obviously, there was no cure, but certainly I'm fairly sure now that she didn't die of syphilis.
Even if the syphilis did not kill her, it was still disfiguring. Back in Dundee, Caroline is almost ready to reveal the woman's face.
What we have now is the surface shape of the lesions as well as her face shape. What we need to do now is to take those lesions and add texture to them so that some of them will become transparent, so they'll be fluid-filled. Some of them will be more hard and scar-like, and that's where the texture comes in. It gives it a more realistic surface. So she's going to look less like her face is made of porridge, which is what it looks like now, and more like she's got syphilitic lesions. Well, we can take this reconstruction that we have with the syphilis and we can try and depict her as she would have looked without this severe disease. Part of it will involve some degree of estimation because some of her nasal bones have been disrupted through the disease process. So we'll have to estimate the nose, but we should be able to get enough of a likeness of her as she would have looked without the syphilis, which would be nice to see as well, especially as she had this mercury treatment.
Xanthi has one last crucial job to do in London, at the Metropolitan Archive. For the last few weeks, Dr. David Green has been going through 19th century records for the area around Crossbones Cemetery. He's been cross-referencing burial records and hospital records, trying to find the names of people with similar stories to the Crossbones woman. David has focused his research on the last 3 years of the Crossbones Cemetery, from 1851 to 1853, because the skeleton was found near the surface.
If we go to the burial registers, we've done it for about 3 years or so, we can narrow it down because that age group was quite rare for someone of that age group to die.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, I mean, you either died young or you died old, but actually in the middle there's relatively few people.
David has narrowed down his research to a few names, but one of them stands out.
So here we have the Dead Book.
Yeah.
The burial registers of St Thomas's Hospital in Southwark. It's a charity hospital. It takes a lot of poor patients.
Right.
And if she died in hospital, then it may be that she's in here.
Oh, okay.
We went and looked at the ages of people who died, and here we have this woman called Elizabeth Mitchell. She's
19.
age 19. The date she was admitted, 5th of August of 1851. The date that she died, 15th of August. She only lasted 10 days there. This woman, there's something about her, because she comes from, or she's in the hospital in Magdalen Ward. That was a ward for women with venereal disease.
Oh, okay. Oh, right. Okay.
So, and on the right-hand side is a column marked medical remarks, cause of death.
Oh, right.
These are scrawled in, so doctor's handwriting doesn't change.
Typical doctor's handwriting.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it looks like it says, ask the physician. Came in for discharge and sores, died under physician's care, and it looks like that then says, with pneumonia.
Elizabeth Mitchell fits the profile of the skeleton. Aged 19, she came to St Thomas's syphilis ward for treatment of sores and discharge, but died on the 15th of August 1851 of pneumonia. Next, David looks at the burial records of the parish of St Saviour's, where the Crossbones Cemetery was located.
Well, here we are in August of 1851. We know that she died in August 1851, and there she is.
Yeah, number 2090, St Thomas's, as you said. 22nd of August, 1851, 19 years. Is that Mr Day is the minister?
Mr Day, the minister, buried her. So she went from the hospital and was buried by the parish. Her abode was St Thomas's Hospital, so they didn't know where she lived.
Oh, right, OK. I don't know why, but for some reason, I kind of got a feeling about this woman.
I think she's a possibility.
Oh, that's quite exciting.
That's exciting. Not for her, but for us.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, historically, it's quite exciting.
Historically, exactly.
Xanthi heads back to Dundee. The investigation of the Crossbones woman is nearing its end. When it began, all the team had was an unknown skeleton from a burial ground in Borough. But a combination of historical and forensic analysis of the bones has brought the case to its conclusion. The team gather for the last time at the evidence board. Caroline is ready to reveal the face of the woman. But first, Xanthi reveals the name and profile she discovered.
So the name that came up was Elizabeth Mitchell, and she was 19. So kind of at the top end.
At the top end of what? 19's not an issue. It's at the top end of a possibility.
She was admitted to Magdalen ward, which is known as the foul ward. So anywhere where the venereal disease
Known as
is
the what?
foul ward. In St Thomas's Hospital, which is why we have records that.
I know it very well. I used to work there.
Okay. In the records from the hospital, it says she died of pneumonia on the 15th of August, 1851.
Yeah.
So
Okay,
a
that
secondary.
makes sense.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. Yeah.
The records show that she was later buried in the parish of St Saviour's, which is where the Crossbones graveyard is.
Okay.
Got some documentary evidence of somebody like this girl who may have had similar treatment in this period of time in this area. Which is quite nice.
So you obviously will never know, but this does fit with her.
very
She is in
good.
the right ward,
That's
she's
very
the right
good.
kind of age.
Excellent. Well done.
I was really impressed.
Well done.
With the historical research complete, it's now time for Caroline to reveal the final piece of evidence.
We've done two here. So first of all, we've got the reconstruction that's done with the disease, so showing the signs of syphilis.
Ooh. The face shows how the young woman would have been horribly disfigured by sores associated with the disease.
So the position of these lesions is based on the position on the skull, that you can see. There was some destruction to her nasal bones at the top, but not at the base of the aperture. So we've got a loss of shape of the nose a little bit here with these lesions, but you can still see the overall structure.
So that is pretty horrendous, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's quite extensive, isn't it? It covers quite a lot of the surface of her face. Some of them are fluid-filled, and I'm guessing if she's getting discharged.
Yeah. Okay. Presumably, there's a bad smell element to this as well.
Well, I would have thought so. This is an infection.
At the end of the day, you can't hide any form of a disfigurement really that occurs on face. There's no escaping your portrayal to the world that you're carrying this disease. No.
Yeah. So it would have been quite obvious that she was suffering. Then what we decided we were going to do was to try and depict her without the syphilis.
Okay.
Because it would be useful for us, I think, in terms of seeing her as an individual, to see her facial appearance without this awful disease which had such an effect on her physical appearance.
And if she'd had access to penicillin and such things, she could technically have been cured from it.
Or never been affected.
Absolutely.
Affected in the first place.
We had to obviously estimate some areas. So the nose, for example, because we've lost some of the nasal bones, is an estimation. But certainly her facial proportions will be accurate, and the details of the mouth is the same as with the
pretty face. I know you don't seem to think so.
Yeah, I think she's quite pretty.
I think that's quite a
Do
pretty
you?
face.
See, I was a little bit disappointed by her.
Oh, it's a good male perspective.
Sort of, I think the kind of would probably be sort of homely.
Yeah.
Homely.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Yeah.
So it might be Elizabeth Mitchell.
You never
It
know.
could be.
Age 19.
Maybe what she looked like.
So I think if we bring this one to a close, because I think we are as far as we can go, the summary on this seems to be that we have a teenage female, probably working as a prostitute, certainly suffering from sexually transmitted syphilis, who did receive treatment for it because we know that there's mercury within her bone. We suspect that she may have ended up, like many would have done, in a poor hospital, receiving some treatment, and like so many, she may have succumbed to a secondary condition, presumably as a result of her own decreased immune system. Pneumonia would be a very common one, and as a result, she's buried effectively in a pauper's grave. It's very sad, really, isn't it? I have to say.
It is. We kind of knew this was never going to be a happy tale.
Well, no, it was, from the outset.
Skeleton,
but I think this has gone as far as it can, and I think it's produced an amazing amount of information, really, that we hadn't anticipated.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a job well done.
Who would have thought we got to a name?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sue and the team have been on an extraordinary journey to piece together the identity of a girl who died more than 150 years ago.
I think the first impression that we had of the crossbones lady was just how small she was. And we had no understanding of the enormity and the strength of the story that was going to eventually materialise from this investigation. Being able to go back in history and using science as the tool to take you back in that history, and still working at the lowest, almost the lowest level of the sector of society, to still come out with a possible name. That's astounding. That really is astounding. That's not something we could ever have predicted as a possibility.
Elizabeth Mitchell was one of thousands of people buried around Crossbones. In its time, it was a pauper's burial ground, but now it's become a shrine. One night a month, a group of volunteers assemble to remember and pay tribute to the dead.
We gather here to remember the outcast dead, the paupers and the prostitutes who were buried here.
People like the woman discovered at Crossbones led a life cursed by poverty and disease. And her story would have stayed buried forever if it weren't for the efforts of the cold case team willing to dig up the truth and disinter history along with the bones.